from where they're tuned in from, and we still see we have a wide variety of participants dialing in from all over the world. You can still let us know from where you're tuned in from, but I will now stop sharing my screen because I would like to introduce one of the panelists for the welcome note. So give me a second to stop sharing the screen. And I'm happy to welcome Aspen Malum from the World Economic Forum on the podium. Aspen has 21 years of experience in the energy sector. He started as an advisor at the Norwegian Ministry of Petroleum and Energy, and then served as Norway's energy advisor to the IEA. In 2006, he joined the World Economic Forum, had different positions there, and is now the head of knowledge management for shaping the future of energy, materials, and infrastructure platform, which is the World Economic Forum's main cross-industry activity on energy. And he will give us the welcome note, being the co-host of this event. And Aspen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Nicola. Can you hear me?
We can.
Excellent. It's a pleasure to be here on the behalf of the World Economic Forum. I'm very pleased to open and co-host this webinar on just transition together with Agora Energiewende, and delighted to see we have such a global audience today. That's exciting. The topic we are discussing today is one that we think will be decisive for the success of the global energy transition. This topic also stood out as one of the most important issues to the WEF Global Future Council on Energy Transition, in which Agora Energiewende is participating, and which really inspired the collaboration for the event today. Many countries and companies have committed to net zero targets and planned to phase out fossil fuels, especially coal. It is clear that the global energy transition offers many economic, social, and environmental benefits, ranging from positive air quality and health impacts, of course, to new jobs that are being created in the green economy. The ARENA World Energy Transitions Outlook that was issued last week highlighted the accelerating energy transition on a path to net zero can grow the world economy by something like 2.4% this decade and create millions of jobs, with every dollar invested giving a payback between 2 to 5 times. However, it's also very important to highlight that in transition, there can be winners and losers, and on-the-ground realities can often slow down or even stop energy transition. To ensure everyone is on board and for energy transition to move ahead as fast as required, it is therefore important to ensure that advantages of transition are fairly distributed. Especially, this is true for regions where many stakeholders and livelihoods will be strongly impacted. A just transition in these regions and other places is one that enables opportunities and equitable solutions for all. This webinar is about designing these just transition processes. How can they be inclusive so that they get wide support and can bring those most affected on board, yet ambitious so that we advance on our climate goals? I believe it's crucial to design the clean energy transition for the many, not the few. The two themes we will focus on, inclusion and ambition, that Nicola also mentioned, are both critical to achieving just transition. If we fail on just one of these fronts, we will fail on the transition overall. The good news is that there are several experiments and experiences from first mover countries on how best to do that. Even though the circumstances in each country that you as participants are maybe living in or working in, they are different, but there are lessons to be learned and shared across the globe. This webinar will present recent or ongoing hands-on case studies and some practical insights from the stakeholders that are involved in making just transition a reality. We, of course, cannot cover every case. Today, we will focus on a diverse selection of interesting cases. We will look to Europe, where the climate agenda has been strong and where we have some advanced first mover just transition processes. We will also look to the global south, where we see growing ambition to set climate goals and coal phase out targets and gradual steps into the just transition. Our presenters today will give practical insights from their experience on the ground and share some of their key lessons learned. Our moderators will also share some of their cross-cutting learnings on just transition from their perspective of the International Trade Union Congress and the UK government, I believe. The wrap-up will be from our host today, Agora Energiewende, who are specialists in the field and who are doing excellent work in building global networks and encouraging knowledge transfer between impacted stakeholders and just transition practitioners. I look forward to a very exciting discussion and hand back to you, Nicola. Thank you so much. And you're on mute, Nicola.
You're absolutely right. Thank you very much, Espen, for telling me and also for this warm welcome. And I'm sure we can look into interesting discussions later on. But before heading into the sessions, we do have another speaker for opening remarks. And this is George Kiauris from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Welcome, George. It's great to have you here as well. George has started his career with Barclays Capital and for the Commonwealth Development Corporation around 23 years ago. Since 2001, he's now with the EBRD, where he now is Regional Head of Energy for the Southeastern European region. It is not a mistake that on the program he's announced as Acting Director Head Energy Europe. George told me that this role concluded last week and he now resumed again his regular position as the Regional Head of Energy for South European Europe. So George, the floor is yours. I hand over the microphone to you.
Thank you, Nicola, for the kind introduction. I hope you can hear me all well. And good morning and good afternoon to all distinguished speakers and all of you connected from different places around the world. It is a pleasure to speak to you today on the topic of just transition. We understand from the science that in order to address the climate crisis, the end goal is climate neutrality. And countries as well as companies are stepping up with net zero pledges. Let me use this opportunity to mention that last week, the EBRD announced its full Paris alignment by the end of 2022. This means that all EBRD activities will be aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement, aiming to accelerate decarbonization across our region, supporting them to reach net zero emissions by mid-century. This tilt to green is at the heart of the EBRD's commitment to help its countries of operation build back better as they recover from the COVID-19 global pandemic. It is very clear that to address the climate crisis, we require fundamental and systemic change. And there will be profound changes needed in many of the sectors of our economies in terms of behaviors, in terms of how we think about investments and policies. So we're faced with a very significant challenge. To meet climate goals, not only we need to support such deep systemic changes, but we need to make them in a very short time, and that makes it even more challenging. Therefore, we need to make sure that workers, communities, and regions are safeguarding against the negative impact of such changes, but even more important, that they benefit from the opportunities. How, as a society globally, do we move from an economy that is highly dependent on fossil fuels to one that is decarbonized in a fair, effective, and just way? Today, to address this question, I would like to focus on 3 points. First, EBRD's vision on transition. Second, few recent just transition initiatives in our region. And third, the role of international partnerships and collaboration. So let me start with setting out our vision of transition over the next decade. Transition is in EBRD's DNA. EBRD was established to foster market economies in our countries of operation with a focus on the private sector, where 80% of our EBRD financing is focused. Transition is our mandate in our establishment in 1991. Now we define a sustainable market economy as one that is competitive, integrated, resilient, well-governed, but also green and inclusive. All our work must support these aims. Indeed, the recently approved EBRD strategic and capital framework for 2021 to 2025 has set 3 priorities themes for the bank over the next few years. Transition to a green economy, equality of opportunity, and digital transition. That is, the transition needs to be greener, more inclusive, and exploit digital opportunities. This will see more than 50% of our annual investment dedicated to green finance by 2025. We would also ensure that all EBRD financings are Paris aligned and scale our transformative policy. As we support the green transition, we recognize the imperatives for a just transition. As such, EBRD has developed its own Just Transition initiative. This connects our green aims with inclusion to ensure equal opportunities for all, regardless of gender, place of birth, socioeconomic environment, age, or other circumstances. It draws on our 3 decades of experience in green economy transition. Since 2006, we put climate finance at the center of the financing that we do. Since then, we financed more than 2,000 green economy projects with our own financing of 36 billion euros, leveraging nearly 6 times more. Moreover, our record on inclusion is equally impressive, with nearly 11 billion euros invested in over 200 projects. These projects have created decent jobs, access to skills, and access to finance for women, the young, and other underrepresented groups. Second, let me focus on the specific investment areas and instruments that we plan to deliver for the Just Transition region. Decarbonization and Just Transition is very important and relevant in the EBRD region. This is because the countries in our region are much more carbon and coal intensive than the European Union average or than the world average. 15 of our countries' operations have higher carbon intensity than the world average, and 10 of them are in the top 20. EBRD's Just Transition initiative aims to ensure the benefits of a green economy transition while protecting vulnerable countries, regions, and people from falling behind. We propose 3 things to do in the context of our Just Transition initiative. One is to support green growth. Some of the carbon-intensive sector will decline, but there are many green opportunities for these regions to be grabbed. This might be linked to the decommissioning and repurposing of the assets that are in decline, but also linked to the growth of new green assets and new green investments across many sectors. As an example, in North Macedonia, the EBRD supports the public electricity utility to implement a 30-megawatt solar plant on a former mine, along with introducing a national accredited reskilling program in cooperation with the Ministry of Education of North Macedonia. Another example is from Greece, where we have invested 70 million euros in bonds issued by Hellenic Petroleum, a leading Greek energy group, to finance the construction of 18 solar PV plants with total capacity of 204 megawatt in Kozani. This is in Western Macedonia, which is Greece's most coal-dependent region. The second element of our Just Transition initiative is about skills for the future, providing access to alternative employment opportunities for those whose livelihoods are affected by the transition process, through reskilling and through enhancing entrepreneurship. As an example, in Poland, the EBRD has invested 60 million euros in bonds issued by Tauron, one of the largest Polish energy utilities. As part of the transaction, the company is committing to the closure of coal plants and increasing the use of renewable energy. It will develop a program to reskill the affected workers for redeployment either within the company or into different regional job opportunities. Another example is in North Macedonia, where we support the government together with the European Commission to design and implement a Just Transition plan through Just Transition diagnostics, where the focus is on the social implications of the transition, such as reskilling and upskilling and redeployment opportunities. And finally, the third element of our Just Transition initiative is to support the regional economic development and diversification, which is simply to help our regions diversify away from the coal and carbon-intensive activities into other economic sectors. And such support could be financing SMEs through SME credit lines, advising SMEs, supporting women in business, financing key sustainable infrastructure, financing the region's digital transformation, and in general, attracting new businesses, mainly private, that will create alternative economic opportunities. Taking the example of the city of Wrocław in Poland, which is looking to diversify from high carbon activities, the EBRD there has financed the construction of a lithium-ion battery factory for electric vehicles. In the same region, the EBRD has also undertaken an equity investment in the healthcare technology company Infermedica, and will be looking to support the company's new product development and marketing efforts. These activities diversify the region's economic base and provide decent jobs. Finally, I would like to highlight the importance of maintaining the international partnerships and collaboration towards the just transition. The partnerships and international cooperation are key in delivering just transition. We at EBRD keep a regular contact with the European Commission under the Just Transition Mechanism to support our country's operation in designing and implementing just transition plans, working with other partners like the World Bank, the Energy Community Secretariat, the EIB, and others. As an example, together with the EU, the World Bank, and the EIB, we have established the Initiative for Coal Regions in Transition in Western Balkans and Ukraine. This initiative aims to facilitate the development of strategies and projects to kickstart a timely transition in coal-dependent regions. We work closely with other multilateral development banks, the MDBs, to advance the international support for a just transition ahead of the COP26. This joint MDB working group, focusing on just transition, completed the first phase of its joint work, and now common principles for MDB support have been developed. These principles provide high-level guidance to ensure that MDBs consistently, credibly, and transparently contribute to the aims of just transition while acknowledging tailored operational definitions. And let me finish by emphasizing the role of policy in promoting just transition. While financing is critical, including how it is structured, the complementary policy work is what will truly make the long-lasting difference and will also attract the private sector. EBRD can support in this area and will increasingly focus on supporting low-carbon and inclusive strategies at national, sectoral, and corporate level. So to conclude, we must exploit the right type of transition, one that focuses on investments that are green, inclusive, and promote broader regional economic diversification. And we must ensure there is inward investment to the just transition regions, and the projects are there to be financed. Thank you very much, and I look forward to participate in this very interesting webinar.
Thank you very much, George. Sounds like there's a lot going on. So let's now see what's happening in some of the countries where we are going to introduce case studies today. And I would like to now ask Jessie Scott onto the podium. She's the Director of International Program at Agora Energiewende. And before joining Agora Energiewende, she was in various positions, for instance, at the International Energy Agency in Paris or at Eurelectric in Brussels, the Electricity Sector Association. Dear Jessie, good to see you here. Welcome. And I'm handing over the microphone directly to you so that we can dive into the first session for today.
Nicola, thank you. And George, thank you also. And it's very good to hear the important announcement from the EBRD that it will be aligning its activities with the Paris Agreement. I think this is something that has been wanted to be seen for some time. But also thank you for your precise examples of how financing is supporting the just transition. And as you say, policy also has an important role to play. The goal of our two panels today is also to look at precise examples of best practice, of learning in both the public and private sectors where just transition projects are happening on the ground, are being planned on the ground in very diverse places. We'll have two panels. The first on inclusion looks at how different actors can participate in designing and implementing the just transition. And I think we should move straight to that panel. So let me, without further delay, introduce our moderator, Samantha Smith. Sam, if you could turn your camera on. Samantha Smith is the director of the Just Transition Center, which has been created at the International Trade Union Confederation, and we're delighted she joins us today. The center works for a just transition for workers and communities, and to get concrete plans for just transition going at all levels around the world. Sam was also previously a global climate and energy leader for the World Wildlife Fund, which is the world's largest conservation organization. And she's held senior roles working on new energy at Statoil in Norway, and started her career in corporate litigation, specializing in finance in the United States. Sam, the panel is yours.
Thank you so much, Jesse, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who's tuning in from around the world. So I'm going to start first by introducing our excellent panel. The panel is going to cover what are the different participants in Just Transition and how do they participate. So let me do that, and then I'll say a couple of words about what Just Transition is and just sort of set up the issue a little bit. So I'd like first to call on Philip Litz. Philip is the project lead for Agora Energiewende. And Philip, if you could just switch on your camera for us for a moment so we can see you. And Philip, for those of you who don't know him, also was participating as an expert in the German Coal Commission, which produced what from the trade union's view is the largest and best example so far of just transition. So thank you very much for that, Philip. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Christina Martinez. So Christina, nice to see you again. If you could also have your camera on. Christina is the Senior Specialist on Environment and Decent Work and the Asia Pacific Coordinator for the Green Jobs, Just Transition, and Climate Action for Jobs Initiative. So Christina is working from the ILO Regional Office in Bangkok and is part of the ILO Green Jobs team. Thank you, Christina. Then I would like to call on Karen Kane. Karen is the CEO of the Latrobe Valley Authority in Australia. So hello, Karen. Thank you for staying up to join us this evening for you. And of course, the Latrobe Valley is ground zero for coal transition in Australia. And finally, I'd like to introduce Yulian Popov. Yulian, also nice to see you again. Yulian is the former Environment and Climate Minister of Bulgaria. He works closely with the Bulgarian trade unions, including our affiliate, Podkrepa. And it finally is the director of the Maritsa Just Transition Center in Bulgaria. So welcome to the panel. I'll just say a couple of words since we really want to hear from our distinguished panelists. 2015 was a great year because 2015 was the year in which the International Labor Organization, which is a UN body with governments, with workers and their unions and employers and their associations, which negotiates tripartite rules and guidelines for labor issues around the world. And in 2015, the ILO concluded negotiations on global guidelines for just transition, which give us a sort of backbone of UN rules and architecture for work around the world on just transition. The guidelines also give us some pretty good guidance on who is directly involved in just transition without excluding others and what the goal is. So first of all, just transition is about all jobs in all sectors of the economy. It's about greening the economy. That includes bringing down emissions, but it's also about efficient use of resources, avoiding waste and pollution, and other issues that are important for sustainable development. Second, just transition is indeed about creating decent jobs, but also about eliminating poverty. And finally, just transition rests on this foundation of rights, including gender and human rights. So that's the sort of big picture of just transition, but the practical bits are also in the guidelines. Just transition has basically two processes pretty closely connected. One is something called social dialogue, which involves trade unions on the one hand and employers on the other. Then we often have governments involved as well. And then you have a deep process of stakeholder engagement, as important as the process of social dialogue, which involves communities, civil society, many other groups who may have a keen interest in or even big economic issues at stake in just transition. So that's the picture from the ILO
Recording
guideline.
in progress.
In
Recording
2015,
stopped.
In 2015 as well, of course, the negotiations of the Paris Agreement were concluded, and we won a great victory on just transition, that is actually in the Paris Agreement, with a reference to the creation of decent work, quality jobs, and of course, sustainable development. So 6 years on from the Paris Agreement, 5.5 years, we now have examples from around the world, many in Europe, but also in Canada, in New Zealand, in many of the countries that we're going to hear from today, of just transition that is either where you either have an agreement that's concluded, or you have plans for a process, or you're having very active discussions about the outcomes and possibilities for just transition. Finally, one last word about the organization for which I work, the International Trade Union Organization. We represent most of the world's unions. And so the Just Transition Center was set up by ITUC in response to the ILO guidelines and the Paris Agreement to help unions get good plans for just transition around the world. So that's what we do. I think with that, I will go straight to you, Philip. So we would love to hear from you about the work that you've been doing with Agora Energiewende on just transition. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sam, for the kind introduction, and pleasure to see you again. Just give me 1 second to share my screen. I was invited today to give a quick snapshot on the German case, which Sam just kindly referred to as a very well played example of just transition process. Obviously, I will only be able to point you at a few snapshots and given the 5 to 6 minutes that we have, but happy to discuss further the details then in our panel discussion, or also refer you to our publications, especially on this topic here. So first of all, as a background, or just as a reminder, Germany, what country are we talking about compared to other countries? So first of all, Germany is one of the biggest economies worldwide, has a very strong industrial base, export-based, and is obviously one of the richest countries worldwide that we're seeing. Secondly, this economic strength was built on huge coal resources. So especially lignite is still today widely and comparably cheaply available. A second point, a third point is that the political system of Germany has a very strong corporatist characterization, which means that consensus building in generally is already one of the key features of the political system. And when we talk about this consensus building strategy that Germany was following, this is one of the elements that you need to keep in mind, that this is something that the German political system actually is very strongly built upon. The next element is the climate goals that Germany has set itself. Just recently, Germany adopted a new climate law, which now foresees climate neutrality by 2045, which is quite ambitious, and is also what needs to be stated here. It's not the climate targets that the coal phase out or the just transition process was actually phased out. It has been amended several times since then. So we have kind of a disconnection, but I'll talk about it a little bit later. And in essence, the transition of the energy structure of the German industry, the German economy, changed significantly over the last couple of years. So we have a decrease of the share of coal usage from around 45% in 1990 until today of around 20%, which goes along with lower employment in those sectors, but also a certain amount of transition. So this is the background for you. And the starting point of the German just transition discussion obviously goes back quite some time, but there has been this social and political conflict ongoing for quite some time, at least since 2010, 2013. The Germans had set itself at that time quite ambitious climate targets, not aligned with the Paris Agreement, which hadn't been in stake there, but obviously quite ambitious at that time. And at the same time, still a high share of coal in its energy system. And there have been some political discussions on how to resolve these issues, but due to certain reasons, there has been kind of I would call it a political deadlock, that the governing coalition was not able to come up with an instrument or with a master plan how to phase out coal. So the trick that the government basically did was to set up a stakeholder commission, which consisted of various stakeholders participating, and the goal was to come up with a master plan to phase out coal in Germany. The participants, these were representatives of the trade unions, obviously, these were representatives of environmental associations, of business and industries, but especially also different stakeholders from the region, from science and the industry association. And what this commission came up with in the end was a comprehensive set of measures to phase out coal by 2038. It was a set of measures which included both elements on the coal phase out sign, so a mandatory phase out plan for the different mines and power plants. It included, but also elements to modernize the power sector. So what does it mean for the energy side of things? What does it mean for ensuring security of supply? How needs the power system to be flexibilized? It will be based much more with solar, but on the other hand, obviously also various elements to ensure a just transition for employees, which include active labor market policies like reskilling, upskilling. But it also included compensations for the utilities to shut down early. Maybe let me say one point on why it was 2038, why was it such a weird date? It was basically the middle ground of the positions of the different stakeholders involved at that time, based on the climate targets, which was set up, which reflected minus 80 to 95% reduction by 2050. These kind of the positions in the commission were basically between 2045 and 2030 and 2038, then basically in the middle of these positions. So that's why we ended up with 2038. Let me use one word on the just transition element. So was it, when we take a look at the results, when we take a look at the results, we can see that one of the key features of the agreement is that it allows for just transition along certain categories. So first of all, a lot of the affected groups directly involved in the process who were affected by these decisions. So they were involved in solution finding in the process and also in the decision making itself. Then it includes substantial support for workers and regions, and which means in process-wise, but also financially. Thirdly, it gives an adequate amount of time for the transition to build up alternatives. And to be honest, this is actually, in most cases, the difficult part. Actually, the difficult part is to get into building up renewable energies. The difficult part is to install or get up a hydrogen infrastructure and industry if needed. The difficult part is to get new jobs to the region which are sustainable and well paid, and not so much the phase out part. What the the recommendations of the German Commission lack a little bit of is the compatibility with climate justice concepts. So it's a just transition in it per se, but if you compare the transition speed basically and the historical emissions of the global north, then there are a lot of things to criticize about the tempo and what this means for other countries, obviously, and for the speed of other countries of the transition. Let me lose one last word, and then I'm coming to an end on the challenges ahead. What we're seeing right now is one key challenge is that, as I already said in the beginning, Germany is currently has amended its climate targets, and which means climate neutrality by 2045, and which also means a quicker phase out from coal and also quicker transition in the other sectors. In essence, what this means is that those more ambitious climate targets will accelerate the coal phase out probably to around 2030. And it kind of shows a little bit the weakness of the German, not the process, but rather the implementation, because you always have some kind of tensions between reliability on the one hand, to give everybody the security that a certain plan will be followed, but then also with flexibility, because obviously changes are, things are changing. It was also clear in the beginning that, as I already said, that the transition would need to be accelerated at a certain point. So this is a challenge that the current government, or the new government, the German government in autumn, will probably face, and which is also something that will be, or which should be balanced very well in other countries when they discuss just transition plans and phase outs. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Philip. And as you say, the agreement is very strong on measures to rebuild the coal regions and bring infrastructure, good jobs, technical institutions there. And also on the supports for workers, so no worker left behind, and also an energy transition that's affordable for poor and working class households, and also industrial employers. So thanks very much for that overview, and also some of the lessons that were learned. I'd now like to go to Dr. Christina Martinez. Christina, welcome. Great if you can switch on your camera for us so we can greet you. There we go. Oh, sort of.
Let me see if I can start. Yes.
Yes. Hello. How are you?
Hello.
So looking forward to hearing about the experiences of the ILO in the Philippines. As you know, some of our affiliates, Centro and others, have been very active on this issue of just transition. And despite a pretty tough context, a lot has been achieved. So please tell us some more about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sam. And thank you to Agora and the World Economic Forum for convening this discussion. I think very important. Today we are really impressed with how many discussions are on just transition, and many of them promoted from, as you said, here in Asia Pacific. Actually, I was going to talk about what is a just transition, but Sam, you have done a wonderful job with the concept and what the concept needs to achieve. So I'm not going to discuss what is a just transition, apart from mentioning some of the examples are included in our last report, not just from the Philippines, but also other countries. And let me talk a little bit about the Philippines, because this is a very special case coming from Southeast Asia, as you know. And by the way, the work that the Just Transition Center is doing is very inspiring for all of us. And I encourage participants to look at your work as a knowledge creator and knowledge generator and diffusion. But what happened in the Philippines? Well, in April 2016, the Philippines passed the Green Jobs Act. I think it's the only Green Jobs Act in the world, but if there is any other, please, someone can participate and tell us. The Green Jobs Act was passed as legislation to promote sustainable growth, create decent jobs, build resilience against climate change through incentives to business, generating green jobs. And the Green Jobs Act is interesting because it provides specific financial incentives for green job creation, including tax deductions. There is around 50% of the total cost involved in the tax deductions for skills training, research and development for green jobs, tax-free imports of capital equipment that would be used directly and exclusively to promote green jobs. And building on the partnership that we have with the government, the government of the Philippines joined a pilot. We did actually 3 pilots, but we said the Just Transition pilot in Uruguay, Ghana, and the Philippines to implement the guidelines on just transition that you mentioned earlier on your opening. And in connection with this pilot, the Philippines conducted social dialogue on the Green Jobs Act with stakeholders, including very importantly, workers and employers representatives, because implementation needs to have the strength of the tripartite mechanism, as Samantha, you mentioned before as well. Later on, in May 2018, the Climate Change Commission partnered again with the ILO to hold a multi-stakeholder consultation with representatives from the government, the private sector, employers and workers organizations, development partners. And the goal here was to share information. It was also to gather input on several policies and systems, including the financial incentives in the Green Jobs Act, the Green Jobs Content Accounting Protocol, and the Green Jobs Certification process, which would standardize accounting of the number of green jobs created by an enterprise, and also the standards for green jobs, products and services. So as you can see, the detail is there. It's not just the legislation, it's not just the inspiration, the detail is there. And we also have another inspiration from the ASEAN member states that passed in late 2018, the ASEAN Green Jobs Declaration. And actually we are going to discuss this later on in an event of the Climate Week Asia Pacific on Friday for anyone that might be interested. But when we look at the lessons from the pilot on the Philippines, I have 2 slides on this to look a little bit at these lessons. I think it's very inspiring to see that there are 5 strategic areas of action that were identified by the stakeholders as areas of work for just transition: policy and institutions, financing, training and capacity building, awareness raising, and very important, social dialogue and collaboration. When we ask the participants in social dialogue and on this pilot to tell us the 3 key ingredients for implementation, they mention awareness raising, and they mean a continuous and aggressive awareness raising campaign to communicate what the just transition means in the context of the Philippines, the impacts, the challenges, the opportunities for everyone to ensure that business will continue to be viable and profitable, particularly small and medium enterprises who might lack the capacity, but also comprise a large segment of establishments in the country. The second element was social dialogue. And I think we need to stop one moment here, because social dialogue is a key instrument for forging a way forward towards just transition. Social dialogue is rationalized across all sectors and agencies according to their mandates, rules, regulations, statutes, and implementation issues need to be addressed pragmatically with actions across all aspects of governance, from national down to the local level, from both management and worker side. And the last element that was also mentioned is the safety nets and technical assistance. And there is a need to prepare, I think you mentioned also in relation to this, we need to prepare all sectoral workers in light of greening industries through income diversification, skills training, proper management systems to facilitate the shift. And we need a continuous engagement with workers, with employers through multi-sector dialogue. And this is emphasized to promote the exchange of ideas across sectors, working towards unity of purpose. And this was achieved in the Philippines during the social dialogue process. There was also some mention to as I put there, the major obstacle that it can be encountered when a just transition planning is designed and put in place. And one of the obstacles was the preconceived notion and perception that preparation for just transition will entail additional cost due to the intense planning and also the implementation of actions. I think this is one of the issues that when we think about just transition, we need also to have very clear, and it has been mentioned as well by previous speakers. Let me finish saying the second big lesson that we can extract from the Philippines case is that applying the just transition needs substantial planning on the ground. And this can be national, sub-regional, and local. And you mentioned before how the just transition guidelines have a specific advice in areas of implementation. And I put the 9 areas of implementation that are included in the guidelines there. But I think the important issue to remember is that those implementation guidelines, those areas of implementation need to be translated. And this might be by sector. One of the things that we are doing now is preparing a just transition toolkit for the energy sector. We already have one for the garment sector in Asia. So is this translation into a planning? And I inserted this picture of this woman, this lady working in a planning, because it's very, very important that we empower women to be part of the dialogue. It's very important that we provide a voice on those regions that are going through just transition, on those local areas, to provide the voice and the creativity that women can bring into the discussion of the just transition. Thank you very much, Samantha.
So thank you very much, Christina, also for the example, for your kind words, and also for the examples from the Philippines. But perhaps most of all, for reminding all of us how important social protection, the safety net, is in just transition, for 2 reasons: to support workers who may be transitioning from one job to another, one sector to another, may need income support, but also to fulfill this purpose of just transition to eradicate poverty. Because we have many people, older people, younger people, people who, for whatever reason, are not in work, who need social protection in order to keep themselves and their households afloat. So thanks for highlighting that important element. Karen, I'd like to go to you now. And Karen, you have a pretty tough job. Working in the Latrobe Valley and managing the government response to just transition. We've worked quite a lot with our mining and energy colleagues in Australia, Tony Marr, Peter Colley, and others. And we know that the coal plant closures in the Latrobe Valley have really, it's been a tough tough experience for the communities, for the workers, a lot of people wondering about the future. But maybe you have some good news for us about how the government is managing the response.
So thank you very much, Samantha, and it's a real pleasure to be here this evening and this morning. And hello to everybody who's joining us. So yes, 4 years ago, the first coal-fired power station was closed in this part of Australia. And this is a region of the state of Victoria in the southern part of the country. 130 years of history and pride in generating electricity for the state of Victoria and beyond. So with the closure of the first mine, that was a big shock to the community and with only 4 months' notice. So the state of Victoria set up the Latrobe Valley Authority as a response to addressing just transition in the community. We're a team of local people. I live in the community, and this was the first time that an authority of this kind had been set up in Australia. So what's really important here, I think, to understand with regards to the work is that we are very much a place-based organisation, but obviously we work for the state of Victoria. And the work that we're doing has not only implications for the local community, but for the broader state and the country as well. So what's really important about the approach that we've taken here is it's very much a place-based model. And look, it was really interesting to hear Christina talk about the work in the Philippines, because I can see a lot of synergy there with the work that we're doing at a very local level. So you'll see the model on the screen about place-based partnering with people and communities. It is our community and very much about how we partner with all of our community. It's about the values and the principles and the way in which we work. And we really understand the importance of behaviour and system change in terms of transitioning and transforming ourselves over time. It's about the skills and capabilities that we bring and the tools that we use. But one of the things that's really important, I think, for the work that we've done over the period of time is to understand that after 4 years of working across the whole community, workers, businesses and community in general, working at a state level through policy, but also working directly with individual groups of people, individual workers, groups of workers through our local trades and labour council, businesses directly with business sectors, and a whole range of organisations associated with our community, really understanding what matters to people was the first piece of work that we did. And so what mattered to individual workers and their families, what mattered to the trade union group that we were working with for their workforce, what mattered to businesses at the time, and then what mattered to local government, what mattered to the training and skills organisations, and what mattered to particular aspects of our community who perhaps had not of benefit to the economy at that particular time. And we were really keen to understand, for instance, 16 to 25-year-olds who were not engaged with the workforce, who were not engaged with education and training, and were out of the system really. Other groups in our community who were having difficulty getting into the workforce became very important. And so over this time, we have really tested what matters to people. And as you can see in the outcomes that have been tested in the last 12 months, to go back and say, are these the things that matter to people? I think these still are very much the focus of our work, that everybody in our community has the opportunity to contribute, share in the region's prosperity. One of the things we know is really important about innovation, about also being competitive at the same time in terms of the economy, but being adaptive and diverse for benefit for all, and that we really understand the natural and built environment, that it's sustainable, safe, attractive, and lastly, very important that our communities are connected, active and vibrant. one of the things that we have really discovered over the last 4 years is that we really need to understand the strengths that currently exist, that have been here for some time, and that we need to continue to build on. And you'll see we've done a fair bit of work on with a whole range of people in our community to understand where those strengths are. So a strengths-based approach here is really important. So energy still will play and will continue to play a really important role, both for the skills and the experience and the infrastructure that we have here. Tourism is a growing economy, and agriculture plays a really large part of this community and is a great contributor both to state and nationally in terms of the quality of the food and fibre that we produce here. And least but not last, the health sector is the largest employer here and is growing. That's not just the case here in the community, but that is happening both nationally and internationally. And we need to understand the benefits and the opportunities there. So the things we have learnt in working with people is around enabling what we talk about as collaborative networks. Networks of people in a whole range of ways that is about shared intent. And that's through governance and mutual governance and leadership. And one of the things we have identified is the importance of multi-level governance. And so it really doesn't matter whether it's a formal arrangement with a committee or whether it's a group of people we work with directly on things that matter to them. All of those relationships matter. And one of the things I was taken by with Christina's comments is this idea of social dialogue and collaboration. And we talk about, you know, relationships and conversations on a regular basis in any way we can to test and understand, work with people on things that matter to them. I've talked about the areas of competitive advantage and how important that is. So how do we build and continue to build strengths of the economy here, but also how do we align the knowledge and skills associated with those new industries and the new economy that we need to nurture. And lastly, and I think this is a really important point, how do we facilitate the development and activation of places, spaces and people? Places and spaces are really important in terms of a community. That's the lived space, that's the built space, that's the environmental space, and how we engage with that space and how we activate those places with people becomes extremely important, and that's come across very, very strongly. People's pride in where they live, making sure that we have a very attractive place for investment, but also people to move to and enjoy what we have here. I've talked a little bit about these particular conditions, and we very much are focused on action. We talk about transition in action. It's not about just, you know, one of the things we fall into the trap of is having plans but not actually activating those in a real way. It is about being outcomes focused in a very practical way, about coordinated effort and locally owned ideas. So if I'll give you two examples of that idea of locally owned ideas, two of the things that came out very strongly in the early discussions we had with workers was making sure that we were working with families directly, but also working with the Gippsland Trade and Labour Council on where the future jobs were and how we work together to provide opportunities for new training, introduction to new jobs, and making sure that we work with the training organisations and adult education sectors to create the training and the opportunities that workers and their families were telling us that they needed. That was very important. On the business side, associated with those jobs is about local procurement. How do we make sure businesses get contracts? How do we make sure we support local workers to get the jobs in their local community? How do we make sure that local suppliers to businesses provided the materials and the support and the knowledge for local businesses to thrive in our community, because that builds our local economy. So there's two examples of sort of very, very practical things which we undertook. And as I've mentioned to you, the way in which we've done that has been very valuable into us understanding how we build those partnerships in a very strong and continuing way. So one of the things we've also learnt is that behaviour and system change takes time, but you also need to understand how do people act and think differently, and it doesn't really matter whether it's an individual or an organisation or a sector. If we are going to have a just transition in a way that develops an environment and the conditions for a just transition, one of the things we have learnt very early on and have paid a lot of attention to is the understanding about behaviour and belief, and how people feel about themselves, what they believe is important to them, and what behaviour we need to understand and work with to have the shift that is being required for us to think about and act on. That's associated with the knowledge and understanding that sits in our community about whether it's about renewable energy, whether it's about greening the economy, whether it's about the right type of training we need in place, whether it's about the capacity of our leadership in our community. It really doesn't matter. It's about sharing that and working on that together. And at the end of the day, if we don't apply and really focus on the application of that knowledge and understanding in practical ways, then we actually don't get to shift the behaviour and belief that's required. So probably the last important point about this is then really what are the conditions for some transformation? Because what we've learnt in the last 4 years is that we really have to pay attention to this, because transition is not a point in time. The challenges that every community will face, I think, around the world, the really challenge of continuous systems change and whether it's technology or climate related or any other change that's occurring at a very rapid pace. How do we understand those conditions, and how do we support a community working in our community to be resilient and ready for and proactive about that change? So you'll see the elements here of those conditions that we're working on, and it forms the part of the way in which we work. So the idea of advocacy and value realised, how do we work with people around advocacy for what matters to people, for policy change, for system change, for different ways of working? That's a really important component. Innovation, absolutely, co-created and knowledge shared. One of the things we have learned around collaboration and innovation is that they are the key to the future. And we've been working with a fairly low level of innovation across our community. And so that's really starting to take shape. And we've got well over 2,000 people involved in some great innovation opportunities at the moment, and people from walks of life taking on opportunities for areas of real innovation opportunity. And as I mentioned, shifts in organisational structures or policy are required. Changes to the way resources and assets flow. So how do we make sure that we are harnessing the resources we've got, making the most of investment, whether it's public or private, and making sure that that's joined up and in a really systemic and systematic way. And the last 2 points, which I've already probably covered, this idea of new practices and behaviours enacted. How do we see the changes? Can we actually see them? Can we actually hear them? Can we actually monitor and record those in a way that makes sense and people can see the benefit? And last, the very, very strong networking and relationships across the system that are formed, that are integrated in a way that we bring all the knowledge, skills, behaviour and attitudes together on a very integrated change that occurs in our community. So I will stop there, but very happy to answer any questions at another time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Karen. And thanks for this look into the activities of the Latrobe Valley Authority and strength to your arm in this work. from what we understand, most, if not all, of the coal-fired power stations in the valley will close within the next 10 or some years. So that's really a lot of jobs. But I understand as well that there have been some good investments by the Victoria government in creating new jobs, and as you say, lots of work with the communities and with workers to help people get new skills, get new jobs, and also to attract new investment to the valley. So on that note, I'd like to go to you, Julian. And of course, when I introduced you earlier, I only mentioned one of our affiliates in Bulgaria, Bulgaria, but of course you've worked very closely with CTUB, another trade union federation in Bulgaria, whose president is one of our officers at ITUC. So welcome, Julian. Great to hear from you about what's going to happen at Maritsa. Very exciting in this transition from coal to maybe worker-owned solar. If you're able to switch on your camera, that would be great. Then we can see you while you're presenting. But if not, that's also totally fine. So please, over to you.
Thank you, Samantha. I hope you see me and hear me.
All good. We can see and hear you. Thank you.
Excellent. I will rely on Lydia to change my slides because I have some problem with my computer. And thank you very much for this opportunity to share some experience from Bulgaria. I will share some experience from Bulgaria and also will focus more on the opportunities and what we might see in the future, but we are not seeing at the moment. So it's since our audience is so broad, I will say a few words about Bulgaria and coal. Coal generation in Bulgaria covers roughly about 40% of the electricity generation. It could go up to 60 in some situations. Right now, at the moment, is 31. The other big one is nuclear. Bulgaria doesn't have a phase-out date. It's quite late in many European initiatives on coal phase-out. And but it is hit recently by very serious losses of the state coal sector and complicated issues in the private coal sector, which I will not go into details. So the problem from social point of view is not so much the possibility of simply unemployment. I mean, there is very low unemployment in Bulgaria, but the problem is how to retain the salary level and how to prevent the skills and the talent drain from the region. So the region that I will be speaking about, Maritsa East, is, I think, the largest energy center of Southeast Europe or the Balkans. It is lignite-based, so that means huge open-cast mines, and about 12,000 people who are directly employed. So the risk is that these people could be employed elsewhere, but not at that salary level and not using their skills and not using their talent. And Bulgaria, being part of the European Union, the opportunities for jobs outside the regions are many. So there is a very serious risk of many people just leaving. And it's not just the people who work at the moment there, it's also their families, their children. And what we would like to see is all these people staying there. Something happened with my presentation, but I can probably go through even without that. So we're facing a very multidimensional challenge of jobs and energy security, but also legacy, culture, future, everything that is known by others. If you can put the next slide, or if they don't work, I can just speak without slides. Okay, and the next slide, please. So the Maritza East is a, okay, they don't work. You can just leave them. The Maritza East is a huge region which offers 240 square kilometers of open cast mines, but the actual region that is under concession is 470 square kilometers. This is really massive. And if you move to the next slides, if you just flip them one by one, you will see the pictures of it. So this is what it looks like. And then the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And what we, the way we approached the whole issue was to try to find some level of consensus and understanding. And in order to do that, we created the so-called Institute for Sustainable Transition and Development. And this institute, which is not exactly a research institute, it has a research site, but the main thing is the stakeholders that are in this institute. And it includes the trade unions, the two main trade unions that Samantha mentioned, but also 3 universities, so the academia, the business, state, and local authorities. And the debate in this institute is ideally consensus-based, but the disagreements inside are natural because they have to bring many different points of view, many different interests, and that's not very easy. It is focusing on the idea of inclusive transition, which is also based on fairness and contribution. So there is a risk sometimes, especially when there are massive European funds circling around, that just transition will be seen very much as some kind of compensation and the financial compensation that leads to people just taking the compensation and leaving the region. What we would like to see is people, talent, workers to be engaged, to contribute to the transition. And we see this institute as a driver, a national driver that leads the step of the transition on regional, but also on national level. But also we would like to see it as international player, because what we believe, or at least I believe, is that the case of Maritza East and what we are thinking and planning about Maritza East could provide a blueprint for transition elsewhere. And this is transition that we call assets-based transition. And if you move to the next slide, I think. The thing is that when you see a large coal region, especially lignite region, you can recognize a number of extremely valuable assets for the transition. In this particular case, it's a large consolidated land, which is 240 square kilometers, as I mentioned, or 470 if you take all the concession land. It is owned by a single owner, the state, so that gives incredible opportunities for operating everything in a fast and focused manner. It has the strongest power grid in Bulgaria. The engineering workforce is highly competent. It has the whole industrial and energy transition. And being where it is in Southern Europe, it has a huge solar potential. It's one of the best solar areas in Europe. probably wind. This is something to be researched further. It has also good transport infrastructure, the strategic geographic position, and it is also an agricultural region. We should not forget the mix and link between the coal transition and use of land and use of modern agriculture. All this creates very good opportunities to search for development. And I'm not claiming that all this is happening at the moment. What is happening at the moment is a heated debate, basically. But the direction of travel that I would say we sort of see, or some of us see, and we're working on, is the development of the region as a major low-carbon industrial hub, which is based on large amount of solar, probably wind, batteries, and of course, when we talk about hydrogen economy, the hydrogen that we're all talking about is the green hydrogen. So it means that this is hydrogen produced from renewable energy. So we're not talking about providing hydrogen to the power stations or to new power stations to be powered, but to make the place a generator of hydrogen. And this is very possible. And clearly, if you develop a green hydrogen hub, as we call it, we can attract the industry that needs to decarbonize. And this is not just European industry. This is any industry, any multinational industry around the world, which is under political or customers' pressure to move to net zero. And this creates a huge opportunity for this industrial hydrogen hubs. And of course, if you have the renewable energy and the hydrogen production and the batteries, you create already the core of an industrial center in the low carbon space. And this is a huge opportunity for a coal region. So as you see, I'm speaking about the coal region in a very optimistic and jolly way. I mean, there are huge opportunities, but of course there are massive barriers to be to cross. And my final slide is just a table in which I try to put the different components of this future industrial hydrogen and low carbon hub, how these different elements can start working together in order to develop a prosperous region. I mean, Maritza is in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s was a prosperous region because coal at that time was what the economy, good or bad, was needing. But we need something else now. And in order to maintain this prosperity and to lift it to a higher level, we need the all interaction of people, but also of industries. And it's absolutely essential that we attract investment on massive international level. Otherwise, people will just run away. So this is my brief introduction of what we have done and what at least I would like to see in this place. Very happy to answer any questions later. Thank you, Samantha.
Yeah, thank you very much, Julian, also for your focus on new job creation, seizing the opportunities that are there in coal regions with all of the grid connections, the industrial capacity, but just needing a transition to another fuel source and some inbound investment. And also very interesting to hear about the discussions you're having within the framework of the Institute. I'm sure those are pretty robust discussions at times, knowing some of our brothers and sisters in the Bulgarian trade union movement.
Just to clarify, I'm not director of the institute. I'm involved on the board level.
Okay. Sorry, I misunderstood your role. Okay. So thank you for clarifying.
But we're looking for a director. If somebody would like to apply from the audience, please do.
The job announcement is open. So I'd now like to wrap up the presentations from the panelists and go back to you, Jessie, because I see that we've gotten a bunch of questions from the audience. And if you could read for us a couple of the most interesting questions, maybe we'll take them two at a time, and then I can help to direct those to the panelists. I imagine we can have a pretty lively debate looking at some of the questions that have come in. So Jessie, if you could please turn on your camera. We should be able to see all of the panelists in a moment, plus you, and give us some of the questions. That would be super.
Hi there, yes. I think one key question that's coming through from a number of the members of the audience is this question of inclusion: who participates? We've talked a little bit about social dialogue, we've talked somewhat about communities, and I take Karen's point about communities that have real pride in having powered the economy, and also about looking at the strength that a region may have, both in the workforce, but also in other sectors. Who is included in the just transition discussion? I think it'd be interesting to hear our panelists' different perspectives, both on what has been happening in practice and maybe what should be happening.
Great, thank you for that, Jessie. Maybe we could start with you, Christina, since you work for the ILO, the keeper of our global rules on just transition, and then I'll call on a few other panelists to talk about this. But Christina, over to you.
Thank you very much. A great question. Who is included? And well, it needs to be everybody that is in the community in one way or another. Of course, there are groups that helps the discussion going and what we call the social dialogue. And we identify them as the workers' representatives and employers' representatives and government representatives. And why we put the emphasis on these tripartite constituents is because they have a huge capacity to reach many others in the stakeholders, like the trade unions reach many workers, much more than one person alone can do by just trying to reach individual people. We have the same situation with employers' organizations and governments. And there are groups that traditionally have been less included. And that's why I mention women, because when we talk about foresight planning, for example, women might not be included, especially in mining regions. And now it's very clear that we need their input, as well as other organizations, civic society organizations. So I put the emphasis on the tripartite constituents because I know how important they are for implementation, but the door, and I think Sam, you will agree with me, it needs to be also open to other representation to enrich the process. Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you. And there are many examples of different ways to do this. I'd like to go to you, Karen, actually, because I see that there's also a question in the chat from a comrade from the Manufacturing Workers Union about who is represented in the processes and who is not. So I wonder, Karen, if you could say a couple of words about who is included in your discussions and maybe most importantly in making decisions, because there is a distinction between who gets to make decisions and who is part of the discussion and who is just being consulted. And in Just Transition, of course, it's very important for us from the union movement that we're a part of making decisions as part of the world of work. So Karen, I wonder if you could say something about the different roles of different groups in Just Transition and your experience from the Latrobe Valley.
Thank you, Samantha. Look, I think one of the things that we've had the opportunity to explore and really have a good look at is the governance arrangements that have existed locally, and think about governance in some different ways. So obviously, there are organisations who get to make decisions formally just through the nature of those organisations, whether it's local government or other peak bodies. One of the things that we have wanted to test and really disrupt, I suppose, is moving away from the usual suspects here. So whilst there are organisations absolutely that represent their constituents, we really want to take on some of the learning that we've got from the European Commission on this idea of multi-governance and networking. And I think to Christina's point about going through networks, now there are different types of networks. There are informal, there are formal, and they matter. So how do you reach out through networks, through people who can connect to the people that they work with, people that they meet with, the people that they talk to, on a really inclusive way to, one, understand what matters to them in the first instance, but two, then how can we take that, what matters to them, connect to other people with similar interests, similar knowledge. And I think this idea of really inclusive knowledge is a really important point. And it really doesn't matter who it is. And I think it's about how you create those networks interacting in a systemic way and system way, and connecting networks across on particular areas of interest that really generates a movement. And that movement then gets a coalition operating, and with numbers you get strength, and people influence and advocate for change through the formal structures. So part of our work is to get those networks operating at very many different levels and in many different ways. But it is about the numbers and it's about the advocacy, but it's also about understanding across those networks the common things that people want to achieve. That takes a lot of skill and working clearly with people to lead that work. And it's that leadership, that cross-community, cross-system, both up and down and across vertically and horizontally, which is the coalition from our community that needs to drive the change here. So I don't think it's any one particular organisation, but it's how we collaborate and find our mutual points of desire and advocacy and change, and how we can shift that, whether it's business or training organisations or just people who've got an interest in something. All of those people matter, and their experience and knowledge matters, and we need to pay attention to the whole range of people here. But it's how we connect them up in a way that people can be heard, but where is the focus we agree on? So the diversity of opinion, experience, and value actually creates innovation. And that's what we're finding is starting to emerge.
Thank you so much, Karen.
And perhaps Sam, I can come in and pick up the second half of this question, because there's another question in the chat implied, the challenge of the more the merrier. How do you both be very inclusive with the networks that Karen's talking about, and not have a tower of cacophony, of Babel that expands and expands and expands? And what's the dynamic between those two? Because both Philip and Julian, you've been involved in quite formal processes. There were members of the Commission in Germany. And Philip, I don't know how controversial it was, the design of the Commission, and ultimately who had a seat and who didn't. And Julian, you're building an institute, and the same question arises by implication, who has been invited to be part of that process, who has opted to be part of that process. Where has the edge of the network been defined for that particular formal entity?
Is that a question to me or Philip?
I think it's to Philip first and then to you.
Thank you, Jessie. Indeed, this was actually one of the most difficult questions before the Coal Commission actually kicked off its work. It took The coal commission was implemented already in the new coalition treaty, and then it took the government, if I'm not wrong, it took them about 8 months to discuss who actually should sit on the board, what actually the mandate of the commission is, because the mandate itself already basically predefines to a certain amount the result in the end, and also the participation of the different stakeholders who would be involved. So in the end, what we could see in the German Commission, what was positive way forward, that the government, both the environmental ministry and the economic ministry, came to an agreement in a relatively balanced commission. This is not always necessarily the case, and by balanced I mean there were certain stakeholders who were very much pushing for ambitious climate trajectories. Some were more from a scientific perspective as experts externally supporting the negotiations, and also other parties also showing more putting focus on other elements. So it was a relatively balanced setup. Nonetheless, it was already, although it was only 30 people in the commission formally, it was already very, very difficult to actually practically negotiate and come to a conclusion in the end. So the actual final recommendations were pre-negotiated in a working group which only represented 6 members of the commission, like 2 of the industry associations, 2 of the trade unions and environmental association, and 1 external expert to lead the negotiation, who then came up with a proposal for the overall commission to follow this, because it was actually pretty difficult to negotiate it on the level of the whole commission of 30 members.
So Julian, thanks for that, Philip. We had heard about some of the need to shrink the group in the end. So Julian, do you just want to say 2 words about some of the discussions that you've been a party to in the Institute?
Yes, I mean, like everything on the Balkans, things are not highly structured. It is more a result of kind of entrepreneurial spirit that has appeared between the trade unions and the local university and a few other people. And it was clear that we have to move forward. So that's how the Institute was built, and includes the trade unions, the business associations, and academia and local authorities and representatives from government. But it is key to understand that this should not be the limit, and it is open to other players, and it should catalyze the involvement of other players. In terms of inclusion, I would mention one thing. It is very, very important, I think, to convince workers of all levels that they should own the process, not just own their jobs and hold on to that and stay there, but also own the process, own their future, and be engaged exactly from that point of view, because the change is happening, the change is inevitable. You should not take a position that I'm against the change, because you'll be just swept away by it. And so I would say that is a very, very important and very difficult also approach, because there are many people who have spent their entire life in one industry, and sometimes they even don't realize how broad their talent and skills are. And this is a difficult conversation. And as Karen said earlier, it is about system change. It is also about time. It happens so that we don't have time. And this is the main lesson probably that we've learned, that you have to start long ahead and not wait for the crisis to come, and then to manage a crisis, plan transition, implement transition, and build a future exactly at the same time. So it's difficult, it's messy. So that's why it's an appeal to everybody to start thinking about the different scenarios and involve people in that thinking and that dialogue. I'll try to answer the question about the renewables online so that I don't take time on that.
Great, thank you, Julian. So Jesse, we've gotten so many great questions, and yet we only have 7 minutes left before we get a long-awaited break. So could you pick the best question, or maybe the question of broadest interest to the audience, and read it for the panelists? And then, dear panelists, after that, I would just like to ask each of you to say in one sentence, so sorry to be a little short on time, one sentence, what is the key lesson that you would like others to know about before they're embarking on a process of just transition? And I think, Julian, you actually just gave us the key lesson, which was to start early, because it's a tough process and you don't want to be responding to crisis and trying to get a just transition at the same time. But Jesse, over to you. What's a big question for the panelists to answer?
Well, I think there's one question that really is very important for everybody. And I think we know the answer to this, but it's very important that that answer is shared. Question is asked, is there a risk that if you start a green economy transition, particularly with the goal of net zero emissions in line with climate targets, if you do that in one place, is there a risk that you offshore the activities and the emissions that go with them to other places, and with them, the jobs? Now, I think we're seeing a trend around the world of increasingly strong carbon targets, increasingly strong greenhouse gas targets across the whole of the climate agenda, as well as a lot of other environmental and sustainability improvements. Nonetheless, is this a question that you have faced in the processes you've been involved in, and how have you answered it as panelists? And everybody's wondering who goes first here. Why don't we start with Christina at Global Scope, and then let's just move it around a little bit, and then go to Julian, and then Philip, and wrap up with Karen, because the Australian context I know is very difficult today.
Well, I think it's a great question, isn't it? Because it's also about the cross-border and how climate change and carbon emissions don't look at borders or don't care. They just go wherever. And I think here, what the ASEAN member states are trying to do is a very good lesson, because they try to move together, right, as a region. And a region that somehow has a culture of collaboration between the countries, a region that understands the very, very challenges they have in relation to disasters, for example, climate disasters, and the employment and poverty also that is in the communities. And then trying to address this as a group of regions, recognizing that each country, each local area might be different, right? They might be advancing with slightly different steps, one bigger and others smaller, but moving away from I do this on my own, and then you might get the negative impacts in other way. So I do feel positive about countries now understanding much more than 5 years ago, for example, how they need to produce change in a way that we all advance, because we have to do it together, even with different steps, but together in the same direction. Thank you.
Julian.
Well, let me put it that way. I don't want to see an engineer with a good university degree and 15 years experience, highly qualified from Maritza East, to leave the region and find him driving a taxi in Frankfurt. And this is a very, very real possibility. So we have to work, especially in not just in Bulgaria, in the whole Eastern Europe, to retain talent with high-level investments. And this is a local issue, but it's also national, it's regional, and it's a matter of European policy, which European policy is not there yet. I'm not blaming Brussels, I'm blaming all of us, and we have to deal with that. The threat of kind of movements around to jobs that are not matching the qualification is real, and it's threat to the European economy, not just the region.
I think it's very important to understand that this is actually, as Julian already said, a very realistic threat, and that is something that is absolutely on the agenda. On the other hand, I also see that there are few elements or some improvements being done over the last couple of years. The first thing that makes things easier a lot is the Paris Agreement and the more and more coming in net zero pledges, because the closer all the countries get in terms of their targets and their pathways, switching around of jobs into other regions doesn't really make sense anymore, because net zero is more and more the trajectory that all the countries are following. So movement into green jobs is something that we will see in all the countries. The second point is that it's especially important that those countries with a similar, comparable industrial base are phasing into this, pointing in the same direction, have comparable goals. That's why it's so important that, for instance, the big economic centers like the US, the European Union, like China, are agreeing on their long-term goals of carbon climate neutrality, and which also makes it important that other countries follow in this, although with a slightly different speed, but in the end with the same direction. And the last point is that there are a handful of instruments that you could apply to support the transition. And this has especially to do with support for the industries that are already in the country and in place. It's not only about setting up high CO2 prices in one region, for instance, also about supporting industries and building up the green technologies that are actually needed to make the transition, like, for instance, supporting industries in green steel making, for instance. So that's not only about shifting jobs from one country to another, but the transformation is actually happening in those countries on the ground.
One of the things I think we need to understand is where the strengths of a community lie and continue to lie. And Julian, our experience to date is that we haven't lost a lot of people in the last 4 years. People have not moved out in droves. So people are staying in the region because they enjoy living here, they have families here, they want to see a future for their community. So that's been really important. And I think with time, leading to the next closure of the next power station here, we're working directly with the company, we're working directly with workers, we've got a much better window of preparation for that. But I want to come back to the point that, we're one community nationally who is facing these issues, and internationally that's happening everywhere. So shifting, as the point is, shifting people around is not the answer. It's about how do we find the local innovation here? Where are the industries and the businesses of the future here? Where are the growths in employment? And what sort of technology and connection across particular industry sectors have real opportunities? So if we look at renewable energy, circular economy associated with agriculture, great opportunity here, already having those discussions about the connection there. So this is the integratedness of this work in a community is what is going to be special about what we know at the moment is what's special about where we live, but how to actually make the best of that specialisation here in our community for the knowledge jobs, the really important jobs of the future. how do we now work on that immediately? Now, we've already started to do some work on that. So we've now got new courses happening in our local university that were here 3 years ago on some of those high-level professional jobs that were being brought in. We're calling it Grow Our Own. They're the sorts of things we need to continue to do. And it's that partnership work around where those opportunities are and bringing all of the partners together to see the benefit. But as Julian said, this is massive, complex work that takes a long time. Takes a long time to build those systems in place. We've just got to really continue to work hard at it. And I think that's not going to be just where I live, but where many other people live. So that would be my last point on that.
Sam, back to you for a wrap up. And I think we're doing very well keeping on time too.
Yeah, so thanks very much, everyone. Thanks, Jessie. I know I had promised you one last word to all the panelists, but actually I know also that people have spent nearly 2 hours on Zoom, so probably also dying for a break. And you've also basically given us the key lessons from these different regions and initiatives. And just to highlight a couple of the things we heard about the importance of trying to avoid capital flight, because what we're seeing is money and jobs moving out of regions in the process of transition, but not enough money, jobs, investment in communities moving back into the region. And so that's really necessary for just transition. We heard about the importance of social protection. We heard about the importance of agreements between countries, for example, in the Asia Pacific region. We heard about the importance of looking to the future from both Julian and Philip, that you have to also look at the advantages that coal regions can have in new energy production, in the production of hydrogen and so on. So these are all key lessons in just transition. I want to thank our awesome panelists for providing all of these different perspectives. I want to wish you strength in your work, because we all know that just transition is not easy, especially for the people at the sharp, pointy end, who would be people living in communities and workers. And looking forward to seeing you all again, either virtually or in real life at some point. So I think we're going to take a break now of about 5 minutes. Is that right, Jessie? So that everyone can stretch, get a little coffee, and come back fresh for the next panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Super. We have the break now. And indeed, I'm just checking with Nicola. We did see 5 minutes. Yes, 5 minutes will do well. Okay, yes, see you all very, very soon. Yeah.
Nicola, I can't hear you.
Yes, I need to be connected with the microphone. Thank you for telling me. Okay. I see not everyone's back from the break. We were a little longer, not finishing at 10:50, but only at 10:55. So we're still waiting for the speakers to come back. But I guess that's fine, considering we have two panels, two quite large panels. I'm very happy with the timekeeping so far.
Okay, well, we're achieving something then, if we've not caused a time disaster. We obviously allowed enough time then, because it's not the fastest, so which is good. It makes it intelligible.
There is a question. I was looking at, hi colleagues, I was looking at the questions in the chat. There is one about the EU Fit for 55 package of carbon reduction. Is the social fund that is being discussed adequate?
Yes, that was from Reuters, but it's also a good question, not just as news, but as a as an
yes,
issue.
I guess maybe some of the colleagues in Europe might like to reply, but it's very journalistic question.
It is, and the timing certainly of the Fit for 55. Yes, some European help is going to be very helpful to enabling countries that can't put as much on the table as easily as Germany. Yes, there will be compromises in the politics of who gets what, and no, the EU fund is certainly not going to be enough for the whole task. Of course, it isn't. That said, it would be interesting, in particular, perhaps, to know, people in the countries that might receive some of this funding, how they perceive it as helpful and what it should be targeted at as the priority. I don't know the fund well enough to know how flexible it is to national and regional preference.
Yes, I'm afraid. Yes, I will have to look at what it means exactly.
I suspect our Polish colleagues will be...
It will be very little for Asia and the Pacific, I think.
Yeah.
But I think everyone's on the podium now.
Okay.
So I wonder if we kick off. Maybe, I think everyone is there. So maybe we can do the official start of session 2. And Jessie, I hand back to you. And I switch off my camera.
Okay, Nicola, so we are back with the audience. Is that correct?
Correct.
Great. So welcome back to our audience for this webinar. And I hope the short break was useful for everybody after that very rich first panel. Our second panel, which is the second half of this webinar, focuses on ambition and poses the question, what factors can help shape ambition for what factors can help shape both ambitious and well-managed just transitions? It's really a question about planning to achieve an adequately ambitious approach, but also one that does not have very, very sudden changes. This panel will be moderated by Kate James. Welcome, Kate, if you could turn your camera on. Kate is a senior policy advisor on international coal transition at the UK government's Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BASE. Kate joined the international climate policy team there 4 years ago to lead on just transition. And before joining, she worked at the UK government's domestic energy security policy, also in the ministry, and has held various roles on energy and climate change, including in relation to the regional powers of Wales and Scotland. So Kate has an international, a national, and a subnational government perspective on this question. Kate is going to introduce the panelists, but also, I think, say a few words from her own perspective as we start this panel. Kate, over to you. I should be able to see your screen now.
Thanks, Jessie, and thanks to everyone at Agora for inviting me. I feel a little bit nervous coming after Sam and her great moderation and a really interesting panel earlier on this morning, but I know we've got an amazing panel going forward. So I just wondered whether panelists, you could switch on all your cameras, and I'll introduce you all first. Then I'll say a few words and then hand back and let's get into the meat of this discussion. So first, I'm particularly delighted to welcome Maciej Sitek, Mr. Sitek, who's head of the Regional Development Agency in Konin in Poland, in Greater Poland's Energy Valley. It's a particular delight, Mr. Sitek, to have you here because just last week, we welcomed Eastern Wielkopolska to the Powering Past Coal Alliance that I work on in the UK government. So it's an absolute delight, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about the presentation and the amazing work you've been doing. We'll then be followed by Jure Melhar, who's part of the Central and Eastern European Bankwatch Network and Friends of the Earth Slovakia. And again, it's wonderful to be here about the work that's going on in Slovakia. Slovakia also joined the Powering Past Coal Alliance back in 2019. So I think it'll be really interesting, Yuri, to hear your perspective of the work that's gone on in Slovakia since they joined, and particularly in light of that ambition question. If earlier this morning, we were talking about the different ways of creating plans and different social dialogue processes, we're really looking now at when those dialogues come together, what those plans drive and the ambition they drive. So I think Slovakia is a very interesting case there. Then I'm delighted that we'll be hearing from Tracy Ledger, who's project manager of the Public Affairs Research Institute of South Africa. Of a real interest to the UK government, South Africa is a key component and part of our Energy Transitions Council, and what we will be looking to what a good COP26 outcome looks like. So really interested to hear about the challenges from Tracy, but also about those founding principles of where energy access came from in South Africa. In those historical contexts. And so the things that we need to think about going forward for that well-managed plan, just transition, that ups ambition. And then finally, not least, is Shrista Banerjee from the director of the Just Transition International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology in India. Again, something I'll be very interested to hear about your perspective, Shrista. India is again another component of the UK's Energy Transitions Council. So very interested to hear about your perspective of how we up that ambition and bring forward more ambition at COP26 as we do the rundown to November. So just before I hand over to our panelists, who I'm sure you're much more keen to hear from than myself, I'll just give you a little bit of context from the UK government's perspective. Obviously, the UK government, our COP26 president designate, Alok Sharma, is the COP26 president. You won't be surprised, a key goal for COP26 is ambition. Is that those big, particularly coal users, come forward with really ambitious NDCs or nationally determined contributions. And the UNFCCC negotiations that sit behind COP26 have started in earnest. But clearly, as we've seen this morning, and as we'll be talking about, and we'll see some great examples, I think, on this panel, is sitting underneath that ambition, or in our COP26 speak, the mitigation to climate change, sitting underneath those targets clearly needs to be a plan. We can promise lots of targets, but it's not a huge amount of use if we don't have plans to deliver them. We've sort of talked this morning about how you develop a plan, but later today, on our panel, we'll hear about some of those plans in real life. And I'll just finish on this before I hand over to our panelists, because I think this really exemplifies why a plan is so crucial. We in the COP26 team, the UK government, have 4 goals. The mitigation, which are those targets, and the ambition, which is what's driving us, and the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC special report really throws those targets into stark light, and the speed of which we need to reach those targets. But there's 3 other crucial things that are the goals of the UK government's presidency. One's collaboration, and we heard a lot about that this morning in our earlier panel, about the different types of collaboration and the different stakeholders you need to bring in, and how that can be culturally applicable to different countries, different jurisdictions, or even transitions and sectors within a country. But the other 2 elements that I think also came out are financing. We heard about financing in Sam's wrap-up, but also adaptation. And that's really, if you like, where Just Transition sits. It's what delivers those targets. And I think what strikes at me and throws into light the importance of adaptation and why this is a key COP26 goal for the UK government is, if you saw the Climate Action Tracker report earlier this year, on that report, it set out that we now have targets that would keep us in line for 2.4 degrees of warming, so catastrophic warming. We know 1.5. It will be pretty challenging for humanity, but 2.4 really will be catastrophic. And that's the targets we've got at the moment, so commitments that meet us at 2.4. But if you actually look at the policy mechanisms to deliver those targets, we're on course for 2.9 degrees warming. So that really shows how important it is. While we drive, of course, for the presidency for those targets, we underneath needs to be the plans and the policy developments to meet those targets. And so without further ado, leaving you with that kind of challenge of the ambition, but also the ambition gap, I'm delighted that we've got a range of panelists here today to talk to you about how they're adapting and putting into place their ambitious plans to actually deliver climate change adaptation and mitigation. First, I'll be handing over to Mr. Sitek. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Mr. Sitek will be speaking in Polish, and we will be doing consequential translation. So just very grateful if you can just be mindful of that. And just a reminder to our audience, please do put into the Q&A your questions. We're really keen at the end of this to hear your questions. But without further ado, I will hand over to Mr. Sitek. Thank you.
Panie dyrektorze, proszę włączyć dźwięk.
Teraz jest?
Tak.
Dzień dobry, witam Państwa serdecznie.
Good morning, welcome to you all.
Chciałbym dzisiaj przedstawić nasze ambitne plany dotyczące Wielkopolski Wschodniej, małego regionu, który jest oparty na węglu brunatnym.
Today I would like to present to you the case of the Wielkopolska Wschodnia, a small region and based on a small powiat.
Wielkopolska Wschodnia to 4 niewielkie powiaty plus dosyć duże miasto Konin. Razem to jest 415 000 mieszkańców, którzy objęci są transformacją.
So Wielkopolska Wschodnia is based on 4 powiats, so small administrative units, and a city of Konin, embracing 415,000 of citizens, and they are covered by the just transition of the lignite.
Okay. Mam problem z przesunięciem.
Can you...
Okay, nie mogę przesunąć.
To proszę pokazać na zwykłym trybie, bez powiększenia.
Wszystko mi się zawiesiło. Okay. Jeszcze raz wyłączę się i włączę, ok?
Mhm.
Okay. Mamy problem. Okay.
Proszę wyłączyć opcję Share Screen i włączyć na drugi slajd od razu. Może.
Okay. Jak mogę się włączyć? Nie dam rady. Okay, sorry. Okay. Będę mówił, żeby najwyżej przekażemy prezentację. Nie wiem, dlaczego nie chce działać. Działało wcześniej.
I'll try to do it this way.
Okay.
And let's see if it works.
Second slide. Okay.
Yes.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay. Naszym celem jest osiągnięcie odejścia od węgla do 2030 roku.
Our aim is to do a coal exit, actually lignite exit, by 2030.
Zamierzamy zaprzestać eksploatacji węgla w energetyce i ciepłownictwie.
And we want to quit the consumption of coal in both electricity production and heat production.
To się wiąże z tym, że zostanie zamknięta największe kopalnie odkrywkowe plus elektrownie, które na tym terenie są i w ten sposób zmniejszymy emisję CO2 o 90-95%.
What we aim at is to close the open cast lignite mine and also power plant that is working with this lignite. And in this way, we are going to reduce the CO2 emissions by 90 to 95%.
A o 55% redukcję gazów cieplarnianych.
And by 55% the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, so all the greenhouse gases.
Chcemy pozostać nadal regionem produkującym energię przede wszystkim z odnawialnych źródeł energii i w ten sposób chcemy zwiększyć udział energii z OZE w całkowitym zużyciu energii do 32%.
In this way, we are aiming to increase the share of renewable energy sources in total energy consumption up to 32%. That means that we want to keep producing the energy.
Naszym celem de facto jest 2040. To, że zamkniemy kopalnie, elektrownie i zredukujemy emisję CO2 o 90-90%, pozwoli nam na to, żeby pozostałą emisję oraz ochronę środowiska doprowadzić do tego, żeby w 2040 roku osiągnąć neutralność klimatyczną dla całego regionu.
What we aim at is to look at the year 2040 and achieve climate neutrality by then. And the limiting CO2 emission by 90 to 95% is an important factor in that context.
Wydaje się, że to jest bardzo, bardzo ambitny plan, ale jednocześnie jest on głęboko przemyślany. Wynika przede wszystkim z tego, że chcemy zmieniać całą gospodarkę naszego terenu w taki sposób, żeby dążyć do tych celów, które wyznaczyła Unia Europejska, neutralności klimatycznej i żeby nie tworzyć żadnych pośrednich rozwiązań.
This plan seems to be very ambitious, but it's been very well thought through. We want to transform the whole economy, looking at the targets that the EU has adopted, and we don't want to create any indirect solutions. We are looking directly at what the EU's targets are.
Poproszę następny slajd. Zaczęliśmy pracować i właściwie w tej chwili kończymy pracę nad terytorialnym planem sprawiedliwej transformacji.
We have started and we are actually nearing the completion of the preparation of the territorial just transition plan for our region.
Ten plan został opracowany przede wszystkim przy współudziale bardzo wielu interesariuszy.
This plan has been developed with the participation of quite many actors.
To, co jest jak gdyby najważniejszą lekcją z prac nad planem sprawiedliwej transformacji, to
the most important lesson drawn from this process is
to przede wszystkim włączenie lokalnych interesariuszy, związków zawodowych, NGOs-ów, samorządowców, prywatnych osób, biznesu. Ci wszyscy ludzie nad tym planem pracowali.
So the inclusion of the local interessaries, the actors, have been the most important thing that we learned in this process. So it was necessary to include the trade unions, the NGOs, the local authorities, the private sector, all of these local actors.
Kiedy zaczynaliśmy pisać plan, został on przygotowany i otrzymaliśmy do niego od wszystkich interesariuszy kilkadziesiąt stron uwag.
When we started to prepare the plan and we reached out to all of these actors, it turned out we have, they came back with quite a few, over 50 pages of comments to this plan.
To pozwoliło nam zrozumieć różne punkty widzenia, ścierające się różne punkty widzenia i pozwoliło na to, żeby ten plan był zdecydowanie lepszy.
It helped us to understand various points of view and to compare them and also to make this plan actually far more better than it was in the first place.
Mamy takie doświadczenie, że im więcej osób bierze udział w tym procesie, tym jakby jest on dużo bardziej zrozumiały dla wszystkich, którzy wokół są. Przede wszystkim dla bardzo wielu osób, które nie są bezpośrednio zaangażowane, nie są górnikami ani energetykami.
What we have found out also is that the more people are engaged in the process, the better the process is understood by all of those who are actually somehow related to the process without being actively participating in it. So we mean people other than the miners themselves or the people working in the power plants.
Poproszę następny slajd. To pozwoliło nam wypracować pewne rozwiązania na przyszłość, które mają spowodować zastąpienie miejsc pracy, które będziemy tracili w nowych inteligentnych specjalizacjach dla Wielkopolski Wschodniej.
So this helped us to develop the ideas on what can actually, what can be the new jobs replacing the old jobs in the lignite, resulting from the lignite mining and consumption. And these are the intelligent specialization and other areas.
Odnawialne źródła energii, elektromobilność czy technologie wodorowe są wiodącymi specjalizacjami w regionie.
Renewable energy, electromobility and hydrogen technologies, we think these would be the leading technologies in the region.
Już dziś, nawet przed Funduszem Sprawiedliwej Transformacji, pojawiło się kilka farm solarnych i wiatrowych.
Even before the start of the Just Transition Fund, we have seen that the PV farms have started to appear in the region.
Zaczęła się budować fabryka brytyjskiej firmy Johnson Matthey, która będzie produkowała pewne części pewien wkład do baterii samochodowych.
Already the factory for producing parts of the e-mobility batteries have started to be built in the region as well.
Technologie wodorowe już są na miejscu. Zespół elektrowni Potowadamów Konin zakupił elektrolizer. Mamy, tak? Proszę?
Yes, thank you. So the hydrogen technology is already there, and the team of the company operating in the region has already bought an electrolyzer.
Będzie prawdopodobnie także ZEPAK chciał produkować, stworzyć fabrykę autobusów wodorowych. Podpisaliśmy wstępny list intencyjny.
The ZEPAK, so the company that is operating currently the lignite plant, is planning to run the production of hydrogen buses.
A wczoraj powstała Wielkopolska Dolina Wodorowa, którą powołał marszałek województwa. Byłem jednym z sygnatariuszy tego porozumienia.
Just to add to the previous one, there was a letter of intention signed for the hydrogen buses, and yesterday actually there was a kind of launching of the Hydrogen Valley project that was opened by the Marszałek, so one of the higher administrative units leaders, and Mr. Setek was a part of the team taking part in this opening.
Będziemy chcieli stosować technologie wodorowe w transporcie, także w budownictwie. Wydaje się, że może to być dla nas jedna z najważniejszych przewag konkurencyjnych, jeżeli chodzi o rozwój gospodarki.
We are looking forward to use hydrogen in transport and also in the building sector. It seems to be a chance to gain the competitive advantage on the market.
Ale także chcemy pójść między innymi w logistykę i technologie cyfrowe, które mają też wspomóc region.
We also are looking to engage in logistics and, sorry, the second one?
Technologie cyfrowe i logistyka.
And digital technologies, yes.
To jest jak gdyby pakiet, który między innymi został także wypracowany z interesariuszami.
This is also the part of the package that has been developed together with the actors, the relevant actors.
Bo głównym naszym zadaniem jest po pierwsze stworzenie nowych miejsc pracy w przemyśle.
Because our main challenge is to create new jobs in the industry sector.
I przede wszystkim zagospodarowanie tych górników i energetyków, którzy będą tracili pracę w tradycyjnych zawodach.
And finding the jobs for all the miners and all the workers from the power plants, so that they can actually find new jobs in these new sectors.
I dzięki temu chcemy przede wszystkim zapobiec degradacji regionu.
And with this we are aiming to actually prevent the degradation of the region.
Czasami zadają mi pytanie, dlaczego mamy pomagać górnikom w sprawiedliwej transformacji, jeżeli przez lata wcześniej mieli doskonałe pensje i pracowali w dobrze zarządzanych zakładach z dużymi pensjami.
Sometimes I am asked why we should be helping the miners who for many years have been working and have been paid very handsomely, and why would we need to help them now?
Wtedy zawsze odpowiadam, że sprawiedliwa transformacja polega na tym, żeby te pieniądze, które górnicy zarabiali, czy podatki, które płaciły firmy, które zasilały lokalny rynek, nie spowodowały sytuacji, w której przez brak tych środków pozostali, czyli drobny biznes lokalny, także będzie podlegał degradacji i upadkowi ze względu właśnie na brak tych wpływów, które są związane z ich pensjami czy z podatkami, które wpłacają do kasy samorządów.
Please bear with me while I try to translate this. So what I am telling them in response is that all this money that has been paid to the local market and to the local economy by these workers from the mines and from the power plants, these need to be replenished by another kind of income, so that the whole region doesn't suffer as a result of not having enough stimulus coming from the market itself. I hope I did that right.
Jakby kończąc i zmierzając do końca, chcę powiedzieć, że podstawową kwestią jest to, żebyśmy bardzo dokładnie przemyśleli, czego chcemy i w jaki sposób budować przyszłość. Nie tylko zatrudnić osoby, które będą traciły pracę, ale zbudować nową gospodarkę w takim regionie jak nasz.
Coming to the end of my presentation, I would like to say that we have to think our future through very carefully. So, because we don't only aim at giving the jobs to the people who will be losing them as a result of the transformation, but also how do we get more people working in those new sectors, so expanding the current market as this.
I jedną z takich ważniejszych rzeczy jest to, żeby nie traktować tej sytuacji jako gigantycznego problemu, tylko jako wielką szansę dla takich regionów jak nasz.
One of the most important thing is to not to treat just transition as a big problem, but rather as a big chance for development of the regions such as Wielkopolska Wschodnia.
Drugi prezydent Stanów Zjednoczonych, John Adams, powiedział, że problem to okazja w przebraniu i myśmy postanowili tą okazję wykorzystać do zbudowania zupełnie nowego, zielonego i dobrze funkcjonującego regionu. Dziękuję bardzo.
The second president of the United States, John Adams, said that problem is an opportunity in disguise, and we are treating it exactly in this way, and we are using the just transition process to build a green and very well functioning economy for our region. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really fascinating. And for those of us kind of stuck in the high-level UNFCCC negotiations, we often think of Poland as not quite the most ambitious. So it's really fascinating and a wonderful thing to see of actually the ambition and the work that's being done at the regional level. And of course, there's a direct connection between the UK and Conin, where we're our north of England, Wakefield in West Yorkshire is twinned with Conin, also a former coal mining, and grappling with the challenges of transitioning away from coal and creating a diversified and green economy going into the future. So thank you for that. And something just to set the questions up, I'd be very interested to explore in the Q&A with you, Mr. Sittic, what you see about that split between what sits at the federal state level and what sits at the regional level. Clearly, you've managed to do a huge amount, but do you think that actually you need to see that federal ambition, those federal plans to move further forward? Be very interested in your perspective on that, but thank you ever so much. Next, I'm going to turn over to Yuri Melahar, as I mentioned, from Central and Eastern European area of Bankwatch and Friends of the Earth in Slovakia. I think this will be a really great opportunity for us to hear what's happening at the national level in Slovakia as well. So Yuri, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I would like to thank you very much for the opportunity to present, and I will share my screen with the presentation. I hope you see it well. So my presentation would be focused also on incentives and motivators from just transition in Slovakia, and I will try to present the national and also the regional perspective. As you probably know, the lignite combustion in Slovakia will end in 2023. And the biggest motivators have been that underground mining was inefficient, which led into the fact that over 100 million euros have been an annual subsidy, which was also translating into the prices of electricity. And the rising EU ETS prices even increased the subsidy because it was very closely interlinked also with the electricity production and so on. Also, the air pollution and very high emissions have been motivating also the regional actors to act, to voice their concerns about environmental issues. There was also a threat of a new mining field for the local spa, and the decrease of 5% of greenhouse gas emissions of whole Slovakia by phasing out the Nováky power plant and the coal mining and combustion in the Slovakian just transition region was actually another motivator. One of the most positive motivators was that the region started to looking for its new vision, a new future with local working groups, which started in January 2018. And what we learned in the last years it was that it's very crucial to connect the local, regional, national, and EU levels, that the stakeholders communicate with each other, that they have clear deadlines, that they have a clarity what happens with their region and with the activities in there. So clear deadline for fossil phase out really helps, and not only for the regional level, but also for the national level. We are also recommending the Slovakia government to dedicate expert capacities, for example, for heating solutions. For years, we have been sounding an NGO and raising NGO and also other stakeholder voices that the ministries should work more on the heating solutions, and it really showed that a clear deadline for fossil fuel phase out communicated years in advance helps also to prepare this type of heating solutions or other very crucial elements of the transition. When it comes to calls for projects, the national government should also include information about EU funding priorities and rules, such as energy efficiency first principle and contribution to the EU climate and energy targets. Otherwise, the governments might end up with a big wish list of many projects which do not really follow the best available technologies or are not in the good category of what is really needed for looking into the climate neutrality target and also the 2030 decarbonization target. So the national governments, when they will be collecting projects, is really great to actually have a very clear communication that there needs to be energy efficiency first, and also the governments need to communicate very clearly what are the deadlines and what would be done with the project ideas, the concept notes, and so on. So otherwise the stakeholders won't end up frustrated that they submitted the project and they have not received a good feedback and a clear timeline. Also, a pressure of quick wins, very fast projects, big projects, does not really bring diversity and quality of the project. So the clarity and thorough thinking is very essential. Which is our NGO and local stakeholders, one of the priority topics was that we really recommend to request the proper environmental impact assessment process. For example, cumulative impacts of fossil gas, including methane leakages during the whole life cycle assessment of other energy efficiency and renewable energy sources solutions. So for example, in Slovakia, our efforts resulted in a way that a waste incinerator was stopped, which resulted into the fact that the company rethought their plans and basically on the brownfield site is now building a solar power 80 megawatt power plant, which would be on the, also on the brownfield. So it has also some other positive impacts. When we also looked on the projects, we wanted to help the energy companies to increase their ambition. So we signed a memorandum of understanding with the both companies which have been competing over the heat supply. And these memoranda have been included into the action plan, as you see picture on the right side. It's the action plan for transformation of the coal mining region called Upper Nitra. And there actually in the ministry stated that they will annually report the reduction of energy needs in buildings and distribution systems, also increasing share of energy from renewable sources to fully replace fossil gas by 2034, and also the ownership of energy communities, citizens, prosumers, and municipalities of the energy facilities. So these three reporting indicators will hopefully lead us to have a more sustainable energy and heating system. When it comes to other incentives for more sustainable heating, for example, the municipality also wanted to decrease the energy prices for its citizens and also participate in profit making. So the municipality owns 51% share of the local energy company, and the coal mining company owns 49%. And together they supply the, they plan to supply the heat to the center of the just transition region. Our focus as an environmental NGO was to bring also expert studies. So my colleagues did a very complex field research where they assessed all the buildings connected to the district heating system, and they categorized all the buildings, as you see the pictures down. They also put them into the special categories and actually identified 60% energy savings potential in apartment houses, 35% in public schools. And these two groups actually cover 87% of the whole energy demand. When it comes to modernization of the heating pipelines, there is additional 10% of energy savings potential, and also removing the 12 kilometers of the heating infrastructure between the coal power plant currently and the center of the region actually will also save 12 to 20% of the energy savings. So in the end, we might end up with district heating, which will require around only 50% of the energy needs as we have today, if we properly renovate the buildings, modernize the heating pipelines, and so on. So energy efficiency first principle is very is crucial in this moment. We also try to bring the know-how from Western European countries, especially Denmark, to actually look for the generations of district heating systems, which clearly shows the energy efficiency is rising from generation to generation, and the temperature levels are falling down to around 50-60 degrees Celsius, where we can utilize also solar energy, seasonal heat storage. Very interesting for coal mining regions is also the underground storage in the underground mines, where you can use the heat and heat pumps, and you can store the heat in the summer and take it in the winter or in the other seasons. And then also using waste heat from other buildings connected to district heating grid. So we are now working on the 4th generation district heating system to be actually replacing the current 2nd generation. It looks like this in the regional small infographic. There would be heat pumps taking the heat from the mining water. Also, the mining water would be heated by local solar thermal panels. Old biomass power plants old biomass boilers would be also integrated. And our goal is to decrease the temperature in the system, reduce energy demand, add several sources of energy, including heat pumps, geothermal energy, power to heat, and also the energy surplus heating to integrate into the system and make it much more sustainable in the future. So this is summarizing it a little bit. Also, with the zoning plan, there are possible areas for fields and alternatively for heat and electricity storage. There is also and a plan to do a heat transport plan to modernize the distribution system to make it much better managed and to actually control and monitor how it works. And this is a summary of different levels where we have different opportunities also for the future. When it comes to local level, there is a strong need to build capacities. So I'm very happy to say that Slovakia actually put into its national energy and climate plan a very good measure, which is regional sustainable energy centers, which will create capacities of energy, transport, buildings, and other experts in the region to decarbonize the region directly. It will be like internal capacities, not like external consultants for private companies, which will take away the know-how, but it will be direct to people in the region. We also cooperate closely with energy experts from the companies' energies, which are creating these energy solutions. We try to involve municipalities into building these capacities, renovating the public buildings, and territorial planning. We also had and plan to have more cooperation with the JASPERS experts to actually assess our feasibility study of the 4th generation district heating system. And when it comes to regional cooperation, there are documents of development of the region. For example, the Upper Nitra region is also looking into possibilities of utilizing hydrogen in trains or also in other areas. And when it comes to national level, there is a big need to revise the National Energy and Climate Plan to include 2050 National Climate Neutrality Model, and also, for example, include the prosumers legislation, and then also revising the action plan for the Upper Nitra region and the territorial just transition plans accordingly. When it comes to international cooperation, we also try to involve students from heating, students studying heating in Aalborg University in Denmark, and also the Just Transition community. Thank you very much. If you would like to see more information, you can find also on the website Just Transition Info, where you can find also other. Thank you.
Yuri, thank you ever so much. Fascinating and fascinating to follow on and understand what sits at that national level as a driver and then what's at the local. And particularly really interesting what you were saying about the role of energy efficiency. In the UK, we know that's a key tenet of moving to meeting our carbon targets in our households, but also ensuring that cheaper energy for households too. But a crucial link to the just transition, because it's a slightly crude stat, but for every 1 million invested in fossil fuels, we know that produces about 7 full-time jobs. But in clean and green energy and energy efficiency, for the same amount, we get 27 jobs, and a huge amount of those are retrofitting our housing stock and our energy and heating. So really interesting to see how that's being used in full brownfield sites and those future jobs. So just moving on, and thank you, Yuri. Moving on now to Sritha Banerjee, who's Director of the Just Transition International Forum for Environment, Sustainability and Technology in India. And now we'll see that kind of global perspective. So over to you.
Thank you, Kate. So I'll just share my screen. So am I clearly audible?
You are indeed.
Okay, thanks. So, so from India's perspective, and thank you all for having us being part of this forum, because just transition is still at a very, very nascent stage in India, and the conversation is only at a beginning. And so I believe that this year with the COP and of course India's commitment to boost renewable energy, which we have very, very ambition about, will facilitate, will be a major impetus, in fact, for just transition. So with that, I'll just add one, I had just added this statistics because India does not have a net zero target yet. And it is very much on the talks. But what will be a determining factor for India's just transition is our energy transition pathways. And just this year, 2 studies have come out. In fact, 2 modeling studies have come out, one by the International Energy Agency and the other by one of the research institutes in India, TERI, and in fact, Shell, a joint publication. And what these 2 studies essentially are showing that what can be a net zero pathway for India, one targeting about 2060 and one looking at 2050. So in the next 3 decades, roughly. And essentially, these studies say that if we are to achieve a net zero target and aligning with the Paris Agreement goals, there will be significant reduction in coal and oil consumption. There must be. And the common part here is coal, which both the projections highlight under sustainable development scenarios. In fact, the first study of IEA says that we need about a 50% reduction by 2040, which is in the next 2 decades in coal consumption. And the second study by TERI and Shell, it's saying about 60% reduction in coal demand by in the next 3 decades. So that's the time frame what India needs to consider in terms of coal phase out, as well as thinking of other fossil fuels, how we change our energy systems. Now, taking this trajectory into account, the current question is that coal is still a very, very central part in the Indian economy. And today, coal constitutes about 75% of the primary energy supply, fossil fuels, and 44% of that is coal. And in fact, it is the backbone still of India's electricity supply, which is more than 70%. But the good news is that there is a lot of renewable energy ambition, and actually RE is becoming competitive by the day here, including storage technologies. Now, given that scenario, what is happening is that the subnational picture of coal is in fact changing. And if we look at the profits of the coal mining companies today at the national level, and I've put up the statistics of Coal India Limited because it is the largest coal producer in the country, producing over 85% of coal. 70% of Coal India's mines are running into losses. And this is a review from their last 10 years of accounts. And this includes both open cast and underground operations, so not just the low producing mines. Looking at a more granular picture, and if we just zoom in, there is a state, and we have been working closely in this state, which is India's top, which has the maximum coal reserves in India, is among the top 3 coal producing states in the country, which is Jharkhand. And 50% of the coal mines in this state is currently temporarily or permanently closed. Now, there are various reasons of coal mine closure, but one of the reasons being unprofitability, particularly for the underground and low producing mines. And even there are some of the open cast mines which are running into losses. And this is a picture of the various districts of Jharkhand that we last year plotted, and we reviewed the accounts. And it really, really shows that even working mines are loss-making. There are so many closed mine leases, like Dhanbad is the biggest coal mining district, Ramgarh, there are many others, but both there are closed mines and even the operational ones are loss-making. So therefore, the picture is not as rosy what the national picture gives. And that's why I think one of the major issues in India right now to focus on is look at the subnational picture and start thinking of a just transition given that. Because if we have unplanned closure in these regions, which is currently happening, it has major implications for the local economy and most importantly will be the social stability. And why I say that? Because if we look into the coal map of India, it is very concentrated into certain states. Just 60 districts in India accounts for 95% of the country's coal production, and there are more than nearly 750 districts in India. So just 60 of them account for 95% of coal and lignite production and 60% of the installed coal-based power capacity. So these are the districts which are going to be really, really majorly hit in the next 10 years if we don't start planning for a just transition today at a micro level. The second question is that there is a major source of employment, coal, in some of the what we call the mono industry districts, where basically coal mining, the entire district economy revolves around coal. And I've taken the examples. Currently, we are working in Korba district of Chhattisgarh. It is the top coal producing district of India, currently producing 120 million tons of coal per year, and also the power hub of India, where over 7% of the district population is formally employed by coal. And I insist on formally because the informal employment I'll just talk about is nearly 3 times of this. In Jharkhand, the next biggest coal state, in most of the districts, more than 5% of the district population have a formal employment in coal industry, which is coal mines and coal washeries and some power sector. Jharkhand does not have much power. So this is the picture. Then the question is of revenue. And these states, if we look into, and this is as per the company records contribution to the state exchequer, it contributes to 5 to 6% of the state revenue. And this is direct tax and non-tax revenue I'm talking about, not going into the indirect taxes. So that is quite significant. And then finally, there is something called a local level fund, which is called the District Mineral Foundation Funds, which comes as a social responsibility contribution by the coal companies starting from 2015, which constitutes a major source of the state and more importantly, the district revenue, because this money goes directly to the districts. And currently in just the last 5 years, this fund has about $2.5 billion to be spent in these local regions for economic development, social infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So one of the key issues of just transition, to brief, will be the informal sector and the political economy of the coal districts of India. The reason I say this, and recently we have released a study looking at the coal employment in India and doing a district by district assessment, which is about, so coal employs about 7.75 million people. Of course, we have also cross-checked with data studies published by other scholars, and particularly Sandeep Pai, who is currently with CSIS. And then the informality is nearly 2.4 times. And this is going by the government records of formality is to informality ratios. This informal sector, the major problem is that they have no bargaining power. They are just informal, they're laborers, many of them are daily wages. There is then the classic problem of subsistence economy, particularly in Eastern India's coal regions, on which we released our book last year. And I have put a picture out of Ramgarh district where I was working in, where nearly 60% of the households that we surveyed, and they constitute a significant proportion of the district population, just earn a living by gathering and selling coal. So they're not accounted for by anyone. And some people call them illegal, but I differ about that because I feel that these are people have-nots. They have nothing else to survive on. Extremely, extremely poor people. Then there is a major amount of informality, which is part of the transport sector in these regions, because a lot of coal gets transported by trucks, and trucks have nearly 80% of informality in these regions. So taking this all picture together and looking into the earnings, so these people at the most have $140 per month earning, so which is very low. And typically they are the bread earners of their family. Now, taking this picture, the informality and the low income, it is going to be a huge issue for India to even plan a just transition. And I feel that's the core challenge we have. The other point I have just put out is the entrenched local politics, because some of India's coal regions are more than 100, 150 years old, like in Jharkhand or West Bengal. And there is a lot of local political investment and stronghold in these coal mines. So it will be a heavily contested issue and a local political issue. And that's why local engagement will be extremely critical when we try to bring in various stakeholders in the just transition process and try to get a buy-in. And in fact, Coal India Limited has tried to close their mines for some time in Eastern region, and they have not been able to because of the local resistance. The second, another big problem is the resource curse in India's coal regions. And resource curse is because, they are majorly the suppliers of coal and other resources, but these regions are stricken by poverty and underdevelopment. And this is a coal map of region, top 25 coal districts that we mapped. And we looked into the poverty, multidimensional poverty indicators, in fact, of these regions. And most of these districts have more than 50% of the population who are multidimensionally poor, which essentially means that they have extremely poor healthcare services, education, and living standards. And if we go into a granular, there are public health centers which have 50% deficit. There are educational infrastructure where, very low enrollment, and all these things are really, really challenging. So the poor social infrastructure and the underdevelopment of these regions is also a certain thing that has to be tackled and is a big challenge. Now, so taking this picture into account, if we look into what a just transition in India would look like, I would say that the first, as I said, that we need to plan now ahead for 3 to 4 decades. Of course, India can't have a net zero target by 2050, given the centrality of coal and, given the economy, the ambition of the country. But what we can do is we can start a staggered planning approach for the next 3 decades, starting with regions where there are low producing, underground, unprofitable mines, which are closing down in an unplanned manner right now. So this is where to start. And this is why we highlighted the Jharkhand study. And we are working in more districts right now. Given the informality in this sector, there should be a broad-based socioeconomic transition. Of course, there will be issues of formal worker retraining and reskilling and pension and job substitution. But the key question will be how to account for the informal workers, which is nearly 2.5 to 3 times, and the subsistence economy. I have highlighted, because this is policy formulation will take time at the national level. But what can happen is we feel an opportunity is at the state and the districts. And currently the key opportunity at the local level is the District Mineral Foundation funds, which I pointed out has $2.5 billion currently. Now this fund exactly has the focus what just transition needs. It focuses on the mandate of this fund is to be used on economic diversification, income generation, social infrastructure investment, and through a participatory process. So it should be about bottom-up planning that is mandated, and that must be done to use this money. So we feel that the structure is there, and this is the starting point at the local level, which can happen. And currently we are working on this issue very much. The other opportunity lies in land reclamation and redevelopment opportunity, because there is a huge amount of land currently with coal mining companies and coal-based power. And if we just look into these two sectors, about 0.3 million hectares of land is available in the coal regions with this. So in the coming years, and many of the land, coal mine closure does not happen properly here. So what the opportunity is that if we reclaim and redevelop this land well, and certain policy, of course, there is clear law for this, but that needs to be revised a little bit. to improve the financial commitments on this. But this land is a huge opportunity for job creation, and it is also an environmentally sustainable act. But it can create immediate job opportunities during the reclamation and redevelopment process, and of course create opportunities for long-term investments, because in these regions you do not want to go for further land acquisition to bring in new infrastructure, but this is the land you have the brownfield in hand, which you can redevelop and reduce community alienation during the land acquisition process as well. Another thing to build upon is the local resource potential, and there is a huge potential in this, and I can definitely reflect on this more. But some of the India's coal regions are heavily tribal, so indigenous communities, and they know how to work around forest resources and agricultural resources. But the problem is that these regions have poor water quality and low water tables. So irrigation is a key investment, and the government of India, in fact, is heavily focused on that, which is a big opportunity to build on, and develop forest-based livelihood, because many of India's coal regions also have forest. So forest, agriculture, the entire primary economy system can be leveraged to boost immediate economy with minimum reskilling and reinvestments. And finally, the good news is that there is business environment which is currently conducive in India, and there is every other day there is a news that Coal India Limited, the private players even like Adani and the National Thermal Power Corporation, the biggest power producer of the country, is right now investing in renewable energy. And in fact, NTPC is also thinking of reskilling and retraining of the workers. They're in talks with Indian Institute of Technology in how to go about that. So the recognition that this coal transition is going to happen is quite said and done. And we feel that the business environment, we really need to bring them together. The government can really leverage on this opportunity to at least start the process of transition. But the key opportunity right now really is there at the subnational level. And I'll stop to that.
Thank you so much. A huge amount there, and I think really chimes with me in our discussions with the Indian government, particularly about the informal sector, that how do you deal with a large informal sector, and a lot of sectors connected to coal, transport and others you've highlighted there. So huge amount, and thank you so much. So last but not least, but I will now move to Tracy Ledger, who's going to talk to us about perspectives from South Africa, another huge economy where we have a real focus in the UK government in increasing those ambitions in the run-up to COP26. So Tracy, over to you, and fascinated to hear on your perspectives. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kate. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, which is the role of access, sustainable access to energy in South Africa, and the way in which this to date hasn't really featured in the just transition debate. So what we have in South Africa is, in contrast to many other developing countries, there's a relatively high household electrification rate. Slightly over more than 85% of all households have access to an electricity connection. But at the same time, energy poverty levels are very high, where we can think about that in terms of access to clean and safe energy. So a significant percentage of households that have an electricity access point, in fact, cannot afford to use the electricity. And so they're burning coal, they're using paraffin, they're burning firewood. And there are significant negative implications for that. Thousands of people die every year in fires caused by paraffin. Almost 1,500 children die every year from the impact of indoor air pollution. There's significant damage to infrastructure from illegal connections, which also cause deaths. And the issue here is affordability. So if we calculated that a very basic minimum level of energy for an average South African household is 200 kilowatt hours per month, that's essentially unaffordable for more than half of all households. And we could define affordability there as saying that in order to pay for that electricity, households would have to sacrifice expenditure on food. So about 55% of South African households live below the upper bound poverty line, and about a quarter of households live below the food security line. So even where households are spending money on buying that electricity, they're sacrificing their expenditure on a basic nutritious basket of food. So if we fail to address this, what it means is that we run the risk of creating two parallel energy systems. One kind of surface system where we decarbonize generation, which basically feeds into the state utility Eskom. But what we do is that because of the fact that we don't have actual access, we risk forcing about half of households into South Africa into using dirty and polluting fuels. So what would happen is that this would then obviously have dire consequences. It means we cannot reach our decarbonization goal because of the dirty fuels, and also poverty and equity. The inability to access energy in the global south has much more serious ramifications for poverty and equity. It impacts people's ability to benefit from education. It benefits the food choices that they make. It greatly limits their ability to access economic opportunities, particularly in rural areas, engaged with small-scale farming and small-scale agro-processing. But what we have at the moment is that most of our policy and advocacy around decarbonization is focused on the generation side of the equation. We're not talking about how we decarbonize the energy system at an individual household level. While the just transition debate is largely limited to the jobs and the economic activity that's in the coal sector. Now, of course, this is a necessary conversation to have, but there's very little appreciation of the need to reorientate and reprioritize distribution in order to ensure that we have what we could refer to as sustainable access, which means that households have access to clean and safe energy that they can actually afford. And this is despite the fact that on paper, we have a high-level policy goal that everybody in South Africa should have access to affordable energy. We've never, ever been able to attain that goal. And in fact, over the past 20 years, that goal has become more and more unattainable because the cost of energy has increased by a multiple several hundred times more than the rate of inflation. So when we look at the work that we're doing in this space, we're focusing on a couple of things. The first thing that we want to do is we want to quantify the linkages between access to clean and safe energy, household poverty, and inequality. So we're starting to think that it's perhaps not useful to talk about energy poverty, but more useful to talk about energy and poverty, because the relationship between energy and poverty in a place like South Africa is both multidimensional and multidirectional. So it's not just that because a household is poor, it cannot afford sufficient energy, but because it cannot afford sufficient energy, it is more likely to be trapped in poverty. And then this is obviously negative for equity as well. Our clear goal is to propose benchmarks for what sustainable access looks like. So despite the fact that there is a policy goal in South Africa in the 1998 white paper that everyone will have access to affordable energy, that has never been defined. It's never set a benchmark for what affordable is. And benchmarks that are commonly used in the global north, like 10% of household income, are not particularly useful, because if you have a household that's spending 8% of its income on energy, but everyone in the house is suffering from malnutrition because they can't afford to buy food because they're spending money on energy, does that then mean that they, technically speaking, don't suffer from energy poverty? So we're trying to construct a much more nuanced and complex definition of that. Then we want to identify the structural impediments to change. The distribution system in South Africa is very, very complex. It's shared among about 200 local municipalities and the national state utility Eskom. And critically, the local government fiscal framework, the financial model for local municipalities, is based on the assumption that local municipalities can make almost 40% of all of their operating expenditure requirements out of the profits on the sale of electricity. So the whole system has been set up in order to maximize revenue for for local municipalities. So when we see this kind of conflict between energy as an enabler of social economic development and energy as a source of revenue for local municipalities, effectively the battle has already been won as a source of revenue for local municipalities, which it's a bit of a hollow victory because in fact almost half of municipalities in South Africa are distributing electricity as a loss. But until these structural barriers are dismantled, it's going to make it very, very difficult to change the distribution system, and it's unlikely that these are going to be dismantled on the basis of the need to decarbonize. So even though many local municipalities are purchasing power from renewable sources, which is cheaper than buying it from Eskom, they're using that improvement in margin to try and shore up their very fragile balance sheets rather than passing the benefit onto consumers. The goal of our research is to develop proposals that can make a strong empirical case for reorientating the energy sector. We want to make a case for the overall benefits of treating energy as a socio-economic development enabler, as a way of reducing poverty, a way of increasing inequality, rather than just as a source of revenue for the state. We want to demonstrate that it can increase food security, generate additional livelihoods, and reduce inequality. So the overall arching goal of our program is to develop empirical evidence that will make the case for that, and then build a civil society for change around that. Right, let me end there. You can have a look at our website if you'd like to see any of the research that we have done in this space.
Tracy, thank you so much, and a really interesting perspective, and reminds us of kind of the history of how Eskom was founded actually on expanding energy access and affordable energy access to all after apartheid and the struggle against apartheid. So thank you for that perspective. So look, in my very bad sharing style, we are getting very close to time, but I just wanted to pose a couple of questions to the panel, if I may, and if I may ask you to be fairly short in your answers, if that would be okay. I'm really interested to pose to Mr. Sisik and to Yuri, to you, a question around what do you feel needs to happen at the national level for you to increase your ambition at the regional workplace level? Really interested to hear from you on that split. And then to Tracy and to Shrita, really interested. I've seen in the chat someone asking about clean coal. It gets raised in India and South Africa, this issue about can we have clean coal as a solution in the future. Really interested in to hear your perspectives on that. Of course, that's something that the UK government and others oppose, but really interested to hear your perspective on that question from one of our audience members. So, Mr. Sisik, perhaps I can move to you first for just your quick thoughts on what you feel the Polish government needs to do on the national level to support you at the regional level to increase your ambition. Thank you.
Proszę się odmutować.
Mutowuje się. W jaki sposób współpracujemy, czy w ogóle jak powinno to wyglądać? Wydaje się, że podstawowym elementem jest zaangażowanie regionalne. Bez tego wydaje się, że nie uda się przeprowadzić procesu sprawiedliwej transformacji.
What it should look like, first of all, and the most basic thing is the engagement at the regional level. Without that, the just transition process will not go ahead, simply.
Dlatego, że bardzo często tak się dzieje, że dla stolicy czy centrali to jest statystyka, a dla nas w regionie i na rynku lokalnym każdy zwalniany górnik to jest tragedia, która się dzieje tu i teraz.
It happens so because at the national level, what happens in the region seems to be simply a question of statistics. But for us, every person who loses a job is a major disaster.
Dlatego też wydaje się, że konieczna jest współpraca oczywiście na poziomie krajowym, regionalnym, lokalnym, ale podstawą transformacji zawsze zostaje region.
This is why it seems that obviously you need a cooperation between the national, regional and the local level,
bo to lokalny rynek zawsze zostanie z tym problemem, bez względu na to, czy ktoś mu pomoże, czy nie.
But it will be this local level that will be left eventually with this problem, whether someone or the state or whoever else helps it or not.
Dlatego też my nie oglądaliśmy się na to, co zrobi rząd, tylko zaczęliśmy sami pracować.
This is why we didn't look up to the government to start doing things, to start preparing, but we actually started by ourselves.
Kiedy 3 lata temu, czy ponad 3 lata temu zaczynaliśmy pracować, w Polsce mówiło się, że węgiel będzie jeszcze długo, długo funkcjonował i że jest naszym skarbem narodowym.
When 3 years ago we started to work on this issue, this to many people seemed very odd, as in Poland it was still being said that Poland will stay with coal for a long time and it's our national treasure.
Dzisiaj zmienia się nastawienie w Polsce, ale my jesteśmy dużo dalej.
So today the approach to coal generation and mining is changing, but for us, well, we are much more ahead.
Ale oczywiście poziom krajowy jest absolutnie konieczny, żeby nas wspierać i żeby tworzyć dodatkowe rozwiązania.
But the national level is obviously a necessity to help us to create additional solutions for the transformation.
Drugą rzeczą jest to, że bez zaangażowania lokalnej społeczności i bez zrozumienia przez nich, z czym mają do czynienia, nie będzie można tej transformacji przeprowadzić.
The other thing I wanted to raise is that without the engagement of the local community, which will understand what the transition entails, it will not be possible to actually go through with the transition.
Bardzo często mówimy, że Fundusz Sprawiedliwej Transformacji, który jest, nie załatwi wszystkich spraw i my o tym wiemy. Natomiast problem pozostanie. Dlatego nie są najważniejsze pieniądze, ale świadomość i zaangażowanie społeczne.
We keep repeating that the Just Transition Fund is not the ultimate solution for the transition of the region, and it will not solve our problems. So the main issue is not really the money, but rather the understanding of what the transition entails by the local community.
I dzięki tej pracy właśnie z lokalną społecznością i z możliwością taką, że Fundusz Sprawiedliwej Transformacji będzie zarządzany lokalnie, a nawet nie regionalnie, tylko lokalnie, będziemy mogli tym procesem sterować.
So for us, it's very important that the Just Transition funds coming to the region are actually governed, managed by at the local region, not even regional, but local region.
Także myślę, że najważniejszy jest udział wielu grup społecznych, organizacji pozarządowych, związków zawodowych, biznesu, bo tak naprawdę stworzenie nowych miejsc pracy w dużej mierze będzie zależało od tego, czy lokalny biznes będzie chciał się zaangażować w ten proces. Także współpraca daje niesamowicie silne efekty i my to obserwujemy, choć jeszcze nie ma Funduszu Sprawiedliwej Transformacji.
So what I think is the main point is to engage as many actors as possible into this process, that including the NGOs, the trade unions, and most necessarily the business, because we want to see business actually investing in the region, and this will create this community necessary for the transformation.
Nie wiem, czy odpowiedziałem na pytanie już dokładnie, czy nie.
Mr. Sutek is hoping that he's answered the question.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and a very comprehensive answer. So Yuri, I hope you will forgive me just for timing reasons. I just would like to come to Srita, to come to you on this question of clean coal. It comes up in the Indian context a lot, and just wondered on your thoughts about how we move on from the discussion around clean coal to actually renewables.
For me, it sounds like an oxymoron that these technologies of carbon capture and storage and other really are prolonging the fossil fuel use, especially, at least from the European context. Even fossil gas is problematic due to the methane leakages. And for example, even the flows of money away from Slovakia to actually import the fossil gas are like really, really high. So we see much more opportunities in decreasing the energy needs, and then building local renewable energy sources, which actually are much cleaner, don't require technologies which are not, which are sometimes unproven or very inefficient, and actually can be a vehicle and engine of the local regional development to actually create local jobs in future-proof sectors. So for us, it's much better to utilize the regional funding for these and not bet on technologies which are a little bit unproven and not really energy efficient. Thank you.
Thanks, Yuri. Can I just come to you, Srita, for your comments around clean coal and India and the conversation there?
Yeah. So see, the point is that there is, when we also talk to regional leaders and particularly the, I would say, public representatives, there is a consideration of clean coal, because the primary reason is it is very difficult right now even to comprehend that a coal transition can happen when there is coal being so central for like years now. So that is the primary obstacle. But the question is that there is opportunity of clean coal, and there are, there are discussions around, for example, also having like coal-based methane technologies developing around that. But that does not even, and we feel that it will not go away completely. And recently we launched the India Just Transition Center, where people have come together to think about this. And many policymakers think that there will be a phase down. There cannot be a phase out of coal. And we have to think of other technologies or other mechanisms. But the big question is that even given all of that situation, just considering the power sector, economics and the trajectory of the RE, coal mining will go down, and not clean coal can substitute the reduction in coal mining that is projected, and it is happening. So the point is that this huge demand of coal, and Coal India Limited, as I said, clearly recognizes this, and they even shared in terms of anonymity, and it is there. So for the next 10 years, yes, but after 10 years, no, it will phase down. Of course, how we go about it in a staggered approach, which region goes first, that has to be thought through, but it is not an option. And that reality needs to be recognized, I would say, in the energy transition map, because another thing which I would like to emphasize is that, the coal mining region of India states are very different from where the RE transition is happening, where the renewable potential is coming up. It is the coastal states of India, which are 7 different states from the coal states. So the RE transition is happening at a completely different, the RE jobs are being created and everything is created at a different region where the coal mining is not there. So there is no overlap between these two regions that the RE jobs can substitute for the coal jobs in the coming years, not so easily. I mean, there will be some white collar jobs that will be created, and these industries are diversifying. But for the informal laborer, if you think, their mobility will be an issue, their skill will be an issue, everything will be an issue, and you can't just take them from one region to another overnight. It can't happen. So that's the reason we need to start thinking of this just transition from now. The second question, as I said, is these people, it is extremely difficult even to tell them. And I'll just give you one example of a discussion we had last year. They don't understand climate change or energy transition. And if you tell them that, coal mining might go away in the event of climate change and energy transition, they'll just say that if coal closes tomorrow, I don't have anything to eat. So climate change is a much remote problem for them and coal mine closure to communicate. So for them to alternative livelihood, unless it is created in a phased way, slow way, training them, it will create a huge amount of local challenge even to plan a just transition. So I would suggest that despite the technology, despite the opportunities, we really need to focus on, given this coal economy in this region, the informality. And India has to go for a process. I mean, we don't have a formal no inventory for how many informal workers are there. The last survey we had was in 1990s, and we don't have any informality survey. No one knows. These are broad estimations, thumb rules applied to get it. And how do you account for them? So that's something to really think through.
Thank you so much. And I think that message has come really strong across our panelists of the importance of local engagement. And from this morning is ensuring ambition and that people are involved in designing their future. I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists for your really interesting presentations and wish you all the luck for the future, and hope we'll work together into the future. And I also want to thank the team at Agora and particularly the back team that have done such a fantastic job of ensuring this webinar and all the technology and briefing me and the panelists on what to do. So thank you very much for me, and thank you for a really interesting discussion.
Thank you very much, Kate. I think we're nearly at the end of our event, but just before saying a final thank you to everybody, I wanted to wrap up with a few reflections on what we've heard overall, and perhaps where they take us in terms of the discussion in the next stages. Some of those are about process. It's very clear that a just transition needs to be based on inclusivity. You need social dialogue, including the challenge of the informal workforce that is wider than perhaps the definition of social dialogue in some of the European contexts. You need the community both to understand what a transition is going to mean, and also then to feel some ownership over the ideas that will define how that transition works in their region. Locals know their regions best. That is a message that's come across very clear in this. Then, in terms of ambition, a very clear message from the Polish context, from the Indian context, from the first panel, that forward planning is part of the success of a just transition. We've heard the Polish example, where one region, by starting work at a point when the rest of the country was saying coal is forever, is now in a very advantaged position because actually the overall agenda of fossil fuel transition has caught up at national level with the rest of Poland. Clearly, most of these transitions, particularly when we're talking about coal, but actually with a lot of other industries too, are very much focused on specific regions. And that means the importance of a theme that came out in the first panel of looking to the strengths of those regions. Some of those strengths are physical. Regions that have been energy reasons based on fossil fuels, producing electricity, are where the electric grid is today. That is in many ways the most efficient place to build new clean energy because you already have the land well connected to the grid. It may or may not have the best solar radiation in the country, but it has the grid. And some of those strengths are human, and they are in the skill set of the workforce. Julian talked about the deep concern in the Bulgarian case that a highly skilled workforce does not find itself unable to work in a clean economy and therefore relocate. Now, there is a range of skills across particularly the coal sector, depending upon the type of coal process that we're looking at. It's very different doing lignite in highly modernized mines to deep coal mining, where there's a lot of human labor in that and the skills have a spectrum. Nonetheless, understanding who the workforce are, understanding their skill sets is a basic part of planning to use the strengths that a region can bring. Of course, lots of discussion of new investments and the importance of bringing in new economic activity. Some of that around new clean energy, solar, hydrogen, batteries have been mentioned. Some of it around other industries. Tourism was mentioned, the importance of being able to diversify the economy, because actually a mono economy is at risk for many things, not just the climate transition. And I saw in the chat a mention, of course, of the importance of rehabilitation, also of land and water, where you have had fossil fuel activities that have had a major environmental impact. But diversification is a big part of the message. And then we come to, what makes a transition just? Ultimately, thinking about good jobs. Now, in some cases, that's replacing what were good jobs in fossil fuels with good jobs in a green economy. And in some cases, it's about creating good jobs in economies where actually a lot of jobs have been fairly poor so far, but there is a legitimate expectation from the population that good jobs should also be part of their opportunities. Part of it, and this I think is a really important message from Tracy in South Africa, is also about the affordable access to energy. For everybody, this is part of opportunity for individuals, but it's also part of the macro economy that is going to therefore create some of the businesses and the industries and the activities that can be part of achieving transition also in our fossil fuel regions. And with that comes the question, perhaps, of a theme we didn't hear so much about today, but I kept hearing mentioned in sort of parts of presentations, and we might like to bring forward in a future event, which is opportunities for the community alongside business, perhaps to co-own, to co-develop, to see upgrades in the built environment as part of the just transition, and upgrades, of course, in the natural environment as well. So those were the themes that were coming out of this. And then the last note I wanted to mention is Julian's optimism. We're looking at a very difficult challenge here in our economies as a whole, in the societies of the regions where we have had a lot of fossil fuel activity. But there is also a case for optimism, and with the right processes, thinking, forward planning, you can start to see examples where this has been a success story, and local communities, regions are actually potentially going to be set on a very good path, but a very resilient path for the future. So let's keep the optimism as well. And I'm looking at Kate, thinking of the context of the COP26 meeting. We need some big optimism from above, but we also need the optimism from these ground level experiences in challenged regions around the world. Thank you very, very much to everybody for your participation. It's been very valuable to have the scope from several global regions. A particular thank you to those who are now on quite late time zones, driving into your evenings. Particularly grateful to you for contributing. And Nicola, over to you for wrap up and goodbye. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much to the entire panel and also the audience who is still with us. It's 2:38 in Germany, so lunchtime, and I don't want to keep you long. I just wanted to highlight that you can find most of the presentations already on our website. And Alina, if you could just post the link once more, otherwise you've had it several times in the link in the chat. The ones who are not yet online, we will try to upload during the day. And the recording should be online in a few days. I know there was a message maybe on your screen indicating that the recording was stopped, but I can tell you we're using another platform because the Zoom recording sometimes come out with funny frozen faces. So we've changed anyhow, and we can ignore this message. And if you'd like to be kept up to date on what Agora Energiewende is doing regarding events and also publications, we invite you to register for our newsletter. And with that, it's over and everyone can now go for lunch, for coffee, to bed, or what have you. It was nice meeting you online, and have a good day or night. And the podium will remain for a few more seconds visible so that you're not kicked out of the meeting too abruptly. Bye-bye.